The boy hated to see his father in such a state, but there was nothing for it. His daddy was sitting on the porch with a heavy jug of whiskey cradled in the crook of his arm, like a baby, as he looked out hopelessly at the dying crops of the field. It was his bounty, and his shame. It hadn't been his fault, but he had only himself to blame. The boy was blameless in all this, but that didn't change the fact that he too would suffer. He was an unwilling passenger on this ride, though he didn't think his father knew that he knew that. His crops had been planted a little too early, a slight oversight on his father's part, but he believed it would be fine. The almanac says it'll be okay, he had said, with a shrug as if to remind himself that the seeds were already in the ground, so there was nothing for it now. What would be, and what was, unfortunately was. The rain that had fallen 3 weeks later hadn't been in the almanac either. The August rains had been heavy that year, coming down constantly for nearly a week. They had saturated the earth too much. You would say that water would be a good thing. The boy had thought his daddy would be happy for the rain. But he had spent most of his days watching the rain and drinking sourly. Daddy wasn't like some of his friends' fathers. They got drunk and they beat his friends. They got drunk and they got mean. Daddy didn't do that, though. When Daddy drank, he got sad. He sat quietly on the porch and looked at the swollen and rotten vegetables as they bloated in the field. Bloated as his tears that rolled down his face and pattered on his shirt. When the crops had begun to grow despite the heavy rainfall, Daddy had been hopeful. Maybe they'd be okay. Maybe the corn and beans and tomatoes and such would come in after all, and the money they made would be enough to pay the tax man so they could keep their land for another year. Daddy would still have to go back to the mill, of course, but maybe this would be the year that he could cut his hours down to part-time and spend more time doing something he loved, like tilling the land. But when it began to grow, Daddy's hopes had begun to rot on the vine as well. The vegetables looked rotten, their skin discolored and spotted. Most of it proved inedible. Daddy's friends had told him that he'd have to rip it out and plant again. The ground was fertile, rain-fed, and would grow new crops if he planted them. He would have to do it right away. He couldn't waste any time, because if he waited even a little bit, he wouldn't be able to harvest them before winter came. His daddy, however, had fallen into despair. He'd been like this since last winter. He'd been like this since Mama had taken ill and passed in mid-December. The boy didn't like to think about that. Mama had been their rock, and without her, Daddy had seemed lost and unable to find his path. He tried to farm, tried to work, tried to bring things back to normal, but then he would find something of hers, something that he had missed, and he would fall into a powerful sadness all over again. The crops were just the newest element of his sadness. Mama had loved the farm, had loved to grow things. Often while Daddy was working in the mill, the boy and his mother would go to the field and tend the crops. The money they brought in helped the family, and Mama liked to be of help to Daddy. The boy wished that she were here now. Daddy could use a help now, more than he ever needed one before. Daddy could use a help that the boy might be able to give him. As Daddy sat on the porch and wept, the boy set out to get him that help. The boy had a name, as most people do, but he had come to think of himself as the boy over the past year since his mother's death. His daddy had stopped calling him by his name, just calling him boy or the boy when he spoke about him. Sometimes the boy sat by himself and whispered his own name to himself, touching his lips as the name sounded foreign to his ears, and made them tingle with each repetition. Sometimes when he went to school, his teacher would call his name 3 or 4 times before he would remember that it belonged to him. Sometimes it felt like the boy who owned that name was a different person, a person who had died along with his mother, and his father was the only one who realized it. The boy walked into the woods behind the farmhouse without fear, wanting only to be done with this task so that Daddy might be happy again, so that he could stop crying and begin acting like himself. In the depths of his heart, he somehow believed that if his father wasn't sad, then his mother would come back from heaven or wherever she had gone to, and they could all be happy again. He was old enough to know better, but the heart has a way of tricking us into being hopeful. He was old enough to know that magic wasn't real, but the presence of the altar was something that flew in the face of that knowledge. The altar was something he had discovered after his mother had died. He'd spent a winter in the house with his wraith of a father. He'd found excuses to be out of that house, his father standing at the window of his bedroom and looking out at the field much as he had when the rain started. The boy often felt that he was living in a haunted house, and the boy had begun exploring the woods in a way he hadn't since he was very young. His father was disinterested in chores that had once been a rude clock for both of them, and the boy found he had time for activities that he had once discarded. He was walking the skeletal trails of January wood when he had first found the altar. It was in a part of the woods that he had never come to before, a part too far for him to come to comfortably. It was over a mile from the farm, and the boy didn't dare go too far, lest he be missed. Now that there was no one to miss him, however, the boy found that he had time to range farther than ever before. He had fled from it at first, hearing the strange voices that shivered against him like winter breeze. But he found he returned there more often as the voices whispered for him to come and see. The voices led him to a strange collection of stones, something not formed by any tectonic movement that he was aware of. The shapes had been wrought by the hands of a madman, and the angles were rude and mesmerizing. Inside the altar was a tiny house, a small cottage with windows that seemed to glow if he looked at it. It was all nestled within a grove of skeletal vines and thorny branches. The boy had ducked beneath them carefully, not wanting to get pricked, and it almost appeared that someone had been trying to hide it behind all that spiky greenery. The whispery voice had cheered him on every step of the way, and as he finally stood before the beautiful monstrosity, he heard them clearly for the first time. They told him they were the remains of a forgotten religion, a shrine to a misplaced deity, and with the boy's help, they could be again. The boy listened. The boy absorbed their words, and the more he heard, the more he wanted to hear. He returned many times that winter, cutting back the vines and cleaning up the altar as he tried to make the space holy once more. The boy had never been religious before. His parents had attended church, but none of them had been what you would call devout. As the voice washed over him, though, he felt and saw the importance in a way he never had before. He spent a lot of time at the altar, listening to the voices, hearing the history of the forgotten god it represented. They told of a strange place, a place outside of time, a place where the Green Man did battle with the Pale Lady, his eternal enemy. The two were locked in a struggle as old as time itself, and would likely be intertwined until the universe collapsed. The boy found that he liked listening to the stories, leaning his head against the altar and feeling the vibrations in his bones. Once spring came, however, his father needed him in the field, and he was able to spend less time in the woods. He still maintained the altar, and still visited when he could find the time, but he was lucky to get to the spot once or twice a week. The voices thanked him for helping them, and the boy continued to listen to their history. He heard about places strange and foreign, and his mind was open to the possibilities of something beyond his simple town and simple life. His family had existed in Frazier for generations. The farm they owned had been his great-great-great-great-grandfather's reward for surviving the Civil War and being allowed to return home mostly whole. None of them had ever gone far from the home. His father had a brother who had gone to college, a brother who lived far away and rarely visited, but most of the family lived close and rarely went beyond the borders of their own farm. Suddenly, the boy longed to see these places. Fortunately, the voice told him how this could be. Unfortunately, the boy knew that he couldn't leave his father right now, no matter what the voices said. His daddy had just lost Mama, and the boy often found himself cooking for him so he would eat. His father might very well waste away without him. He wanted to go, but he was torn between the unknown and the real tragedy of watching his father suffer. The voices assured him that there was time, that they would be here when the time was right, and promised the boy a boon for his efforts. "When the time is right, we will grant you anything your heart desires, but only when you are ready to give yourself fully to our cause." The boy had noticed that the voice was not as strong as it had been when spring came around, and in summer it was little more than a spidery whisper. The growth came back stronger during the hot months, some of it seeming to grow back overnight, and the boy had to be diligent to keep it cut back. He didn't mind. The altar had become his joy in life, and he longed for the times he spent there. The stones told him how they appreciated his tending of them, and as summer waned and fall began, the voices built in strength again. That was good, because the boy had been worried that something had happened to it. As it came back to life at the end of the hot months, it began to tell him again how he could have his reward, and more, if only he would take his place at the side of the green. The boy had resisted, but after watching his father's suffering, he felt he was ready to accept his boon. As the boy came upon the glen where the altar lay, he knew now that the time had come. The voices welcomed him and rejoiced at his return, and when he made his request, they asked if that was all. "Yes," the boy told them. "I just want my daddy to be happy again. I want his crops to grow. I want him to feel hopeful. I want him to stop crying. Please," he begged, before the alien receptacle, "make my daddy happy, and I'll help you in whatever it is you need." The voices chattered amongst themselves, and when they returned, they agreed to help the boy. They agreed, and they gave him a token to wear, a token of their Lord's favor. "Put it on and come with us, for there is much preparation to make." As the gourd slid over his head, the boy was at peace. As his voice filled his head, the boy forgot his name in true and became a vessel for the green. Daniel Mossel awoke the next morning to find that a miracle had happened as he slept. He stretched the ache from his muscles, the cost of sleeping on the porch in October, and discovered that the bloated and worthless vegetables that would likely make up his late-season crop had been replaced by hale and hardy plants that would likely survive the depths of winter. Corn so crisp you could taste it with your eyes. Beans hardy enough to grace a dozen tables. Squash and yams and potatoes and things he didn't even remember planting, and all of it ripe and ready for harvest. He had been as amazed as the boy had been, but as he set to picking, something seemed wrong. Someone should be here with him. Someone should be helping him with these vegetables. But he couldn't think who. His mind immediately went to his wife, but she couldn't help him now. She was dead, had been dead for half a year and more, and it was only ever just the two of them. He wished he'd had a son to help him now, a son to carry his legacy when his bones were in the ground, but wishful thinking would no more make him a son than it would bring the harvest in, and Daniel set to his job. He was already counting the money that Wayne Hauser would hand him at the farmer's market after he loosed his long, low whistle at the sight of all that gleaming produce in the back of his truck. From the edge of the field, the boy looked on through the diamonds of his new eyes. He smiled beneath his pumpkin head, the coquettish mouth turned up in a stitched-on grin. His father was happy, happier than he had been in a long time, and he would be happy for the rest of his days. The green man would see to his happiness now. The boy was certain of that. And when the voices called him back to the woods, the boy went without hesitation. Fall was already upon them, and winter would be here before they knew it. It was time to get started. The green would be served, and the green man would be honored. This would be a Halloween that Frazier would never forget. Officer Travis Parks shook his head as he looked at the fresh graffiti. Al Hall Green Man, said a particularly sloppy message in runny green paint. Praise the Pumpkin Child, said another in lurid orange, this one a little more coherent. Travis felt an impotent kind of rage burning in him as he saw it, realizing it would only be the beginning of this particular headache. So, you say you closed up shop around 9, and that this definitely wasn't there when you left? Travis asked Mr. Worley, the manager of the Pork Shaver General Store. Mr. Worley gave him a look that said he wanted to ask honestly if Travis's mother had any kids who'd lived, but thought better of it. Travis, despite being 28 and not as vested as some of his peers, was still an officer of the law, and in Frazier, that meant something. No, Travis, I believe I would have noticed graffiti on the front window of my stall had it happened before closing. Travis poked his bottom lip out and nodded, making a note of it. Anyone you suspect might have been responsible for this? If I had to guess, I'd say it's probably Frank and Riley Cozy. They spray-painted curse words on the back of my store last year, and the year before that. This is a little different, though. Spelling is still atrocious, but the message is a little more cryptic than the usual anti-Semitic nonsense they hear from their father. Travis nodded, having conceded that. Even though Francis Worley was as much of a Baptist as anyone in town, the Frazier Police Department still got calls at least once a year about the usual graffiti on the building. Swastikas, anti-Semitic slurs, general hate speech, and some very creative ways to spell Israel were just a few of the things that Travis had seen painted on the building in the 5 years he'd been with the force. And Sheriff Carl claimed to have seen a portrait of the Fuhrer himself done on the loading bay one year, an image he suspected had been the work of the boy's father, Frank Sr. I'll go make inquiries, Mr. Worley, but you know their father will corroborate whatever story they put forward. Francis Worley just shrugged. Not sure why I pay taxes so my store can get vandalized every year. We both know full well that if I were to blow one of those boys away after catching him in the act, I'd be lucky to get a job selling commissary at the Stragview canteen counter, let alone walking around as a free man. Travis nodded, commiserating with the old man, but unable to do anything about it. Something caught his eye as he finished making notes, though, a corona of light from the other side of the street. Travis glanced over to the monstrosity that sat there. The new bank stuck out like a sore thumb in a historic town like Fraziers. But the sun reflecting off the glass had given him an idea. Francis Worley might not be able to afford cameras, but the bank most certainly could. What were the chances that one of them might have seen the crime take place at the general store? Better than zero, that was for sure. Well, Mr. Worley, let me go check a few things. There might actually be a little something I can do, depending on what I can find. Mr. Worley seemed to have noticed what he was looking at, and smiled as he put two and two together. You mean that eyesore might actually be good for something? He asked, a smile creeping across his face. Well, will wonders never cease? Travis had once loved the Halloween season, but as he drove out of Fraziers and into the sticks, he found that he wished it was already November 1st. This time of year was good for little else besides headaches, even in a town as small as Fraziers. Most of the kids in town were farm kids from God-fearing families, but even they got up to a certain amount of helling. Usually it was little beyond busted-up jack-o'-lanterns and some vandalized Halloween decorations. But every now and again, some kid got a little too into the fun and set a barn on fire or broke some storefront windows. It was a headache for cops and business owners alike, but this was probably the worst of it. Travis had brought Sullivan with him, an older guy with some rapport with the farmers, but it wouldn't do a lot of good. It wouldn't matter if he got their kids on film, with their social security cards in hand even, stating their full name and admitting to the crime. Most parents would tell you it couldn't be their kids and that a mistake had been made. They would cry and beg, and then they'd bail their kids out when you eventually had to take them in. And the Comet would run a story about overzealous police forces and their mishandling of minors when November rolled around. Then, of course, there were parents like Frank Cozy. Frank was a retired Marine who'd fought in the early days of the War on Terror. He'd come back meaner and less personable after 4 years in the desert, and lived mostly off a disability check from the government after the transport truck he'd been doing maintenance on fell on his legs. They had saved all of the left one and most of the right, but from the knee down, the right was more metal and plastic than flesh. With the little money he had made from farming, it was no secret he was growing cow corn, as they called it, in his back field, and making moonshine in his cowshed. He supplemented the checks he made and had a bit of a comfy living. After his wife left him with the kids about 6 or 8 years ago, who could remember, he had just kind of sat out on the homestead and got less and less sociable. Less sociable and more angry about things that had no basis out here in the middle of nowhere. Best you let me do the talking when we get there, Sullivan said, smiling at Travis to show it was nothing personal. I've tipped a glass with him at the Veterans Hall from time to time, and he may be willing to hear me out. Travis nodded, but quite frankly, he didn't care if Frank Cozy heard them out or not. The bank across the street had been more than happy to show them their security tapes, and Travis had seen the pair roll up on their bikes at about 11:30, bags of spray paint hanging from the handlebars. They had been smart, wearing fluorescent orange masks that kind of looked like pumpkins, but the bikes were the same red beat-up Huffies that they had ridden since they could ride at all. They had sprayed the messages on the front of the glass and then pulled off, the whole process taking less than about 20 minutes. Travis had talked to Sheriff Carl about it and had gotten permission to bring the boys in, their father in tow, if need be. As they pulled into the yard, they could both see Frank sitting on the porch, as if expecting company. The red Huffies were parked beside said porch, both plainly the same ones in the video. To Travis's surprise, one of them still had the gray bag hanging off the handlebars, the contents heavy as they swung down. "Let me do the talking," Sullivan reiterated, climbing out as he greeted Frank warmly. Travis stepped out slowly, letting Sullivan get a few steps ahead before he moved to back him up. "What's this about?" Farmer Cozy asked, cutting Sullivan off in the middle of his pleasantries. "Well, Frank, we have reason to believe that your boys were involved in some helling last night about 11. We just want to ask them some questions so we can clear them up as suspects. Are they..." "They were here all night. They were both in bed by 9. Saw 'em myself." "No one's saying you didn't, Frank. All we're saying is, we got 'em on camera, Mr. Cozy," Travis said, already bored with the back and forth. "We can place them at the scene." "Is that a fact?" Frank Cozy asked. "Well, you must be mistaken. I done told you that." Yeah, we heard you, and we're telling you that we want them for questioning. Now you can either go get them, or we can go get them. Your choice." Frank opened his mouth to say something that would likely have put him in the back of the car with his brats, but he was saved a trip to the station when his oldest son came out on the porch. Frank Jr. was still wearing his jeans, the same jeans he'd worn the night before, complete with a green smear across one side, and Riley was standing in the doorway not far behind him, in a similar state. Even from here, Travis could see the orange specks on his hands, and they would likely find more in his nail beds if they looked. Frank Sr. gave his oldest a look, clearly not expecting him to be stupid enough to step outside. But if he noticed, Frank Jr. slowed not at all. "He told you what you wanted to know, so why don't you take yourself back to town?" Sullivan looked uncomfortable, the exchange clearly not going the way he'd expected, but Travis smiled knowingly as he pointed to the stain on the older boy's jeans. "What's that, then?" Frank Jr. looked indignant, clearly taking after his father when it came to talking to the law, but one look at his pants and both generations of Frank clearly knew the jig was up. "Go on then, boy," Frank Sr. said. "You too, Riley. You made a balls up of it now, so you'll have to take your licks." "But Pa," Frank Jr. said, but his father waved a hand at him. "Go on now. Best be done with it. Maybe learn a little something from your stupidity so you don't go repeating it again." Travis had little doubt that the lesson was not to follow the rules of polite society, and was more likely to clean up after committing crimes next time, but it didn't matter much to him. As they climbed into the back of the car, Travis realized that he had gotten off easy, though maybe not as easy as he thought. "I ain't saying nothing," Frank Jr. said, and Travis was starting to lose some of his patience. They had both of them in the station's only interrogation room, but it seemed that neither of them was willing to elaborate on why they had spray-painted the messages. The sheriff didn't really care about the whys. He only really cared that they had sprayed the messages, and that now they would be made to answer for it. Both of them were minors, Riley barely in high school, but they could still be charged for vandalism, and for the previous vandalisms as well, if they played their cards right. The problem was that this didn't fit their usual pattern of vandalism, and Travis was worried that they couldn't make them stick. "We don't really need a statement, boys," he said, trying a different gambit. "We got the two of you on camera doing the crime. What we really were curious about was the message." "I ain't saying nothing," Frank Jr. reiterated for about the 100th time. Riley, however, looked like he might be getting a little tired of the game. "Look, if someone put you boys up to this, we just want to make sure they get in trouble too. You don't have to take all the blame for yourself." "I ain't saying..." "Frank, why don't we just tell them about the..." Riley cowered a little as Frank rounded on him, his eyes containing drops of fire as he dared him to go on.
"Shut the hell up, Riley. We ain't saying nothing."
But he told us to do it. If we just tell him, then they... Travis surged forward as Frank Jr. swung his hand at his younger brother, catching him by the wrist before he could backhand him. None of that. If you two want to beat each other up, you can do it after you get out of here. Now, who told the both of you to do this? He was looking at Riley as he asked, but it appeared his brother's outburst had cowed him. He sat shaking, not daring to look at his older brother, as the two sat in silence. "Fine," Travis said. "I guess it's just the two of you that can suffer then. The rough estimate on what you did is around $300 worth of damage to the general store. I'm guessing your daddy is good for it, so we can proceed with booking you, and you can wait for..." He stopped as someone knocked on the door to the little room. He told the boys to excuse him and stepped out to find Cheryl, the station's dispatcher, looking unsure of herself. "What's wrong? I'm in the middle of an interview," Travis asked. "Sheriff Carl said he's got another vandal coming in." Travis gave her a minute, waiting for her to explain, but when it seemed that nothing was forthcoming, he prompted her to continue. "So? It's another middle schooler. This one tagged the Legion Hall in the middle of the day." "So?" Travis prompted again, wanting to know what this had to do with him. "He tagged it with the same message as these two. The exact same message." Now Travis understood. This was a pattern, another perpetrator, claiming to have been moved by someone else. And they might be a little more receptive to talking than the Cozy boys. If this was some orchestrated prank, maybe Travis could nip it in the bud before it got out of hand. "Tell him to bring the kid into the interview room. I'm about to make some room for him." Cheryl nodded and headed back to the desk, Travis turning back to the boys to give them the bad news. Well, looks like I don't need your statement after all. I guess you can both go back to holding. This fella coming in seems way more willing to cooperate." "He won't talk," Riley said, taking Travis completely by surprise. "He knows better than to cross the pumpkin." But Frank's hand made a meaty sound as it hit his brother's mouth.
"I told you to shut up,"
he yelled, reeling back for another one.
"Don't talk about nothing, you understand?"
Travis caught him before he could deal his brother another smack. He manhandled the larger of the Cozy boys into a holding cell, the younger following behind him and looking thoroughly chastised. Travis put him in a different cell, as far from his volatile brother as possible, and went to set the room to rights. They had another guest coming, after all. "You telling me that we're looking for a kid with a pumpkin for a head?" Sheriff Carl Hashwin was looking skeptically at Travis's report, the buttons on his uniform straining a little at his gut. Sheriff Carl had been on the force for 20 years, had been the sheriff for 10 of those years, and Travis figured that he had seen a lot in that time. That being said, this was clearly new territory he was asked to plunge into. The man dealt with speeders, people who wrote bad checks, and the occasional act of petty theft. Vandals, led by an odd person in a carved pumpkin head, were something different. I'm sure what they meant was someone wearing a jack-o'-lantern, but that's the description I was given. The Wilby kid was more than happy to describe him for me. Apparently the kid assured him that he wouldn't get caught. I brought it to Riley Cozy, and the boy as good as identified him as the same kid who had asked he and his brother to vandalize the general store. Mark Wilby had been legitimately angry when Travis had met with him. Whoever this pumpkin-headed kid was, he was good at convincing people, because Mark had opened by saying that there was no way he could have been caught. The kid had assured him that he would be protected, and that his reward would be great after he left his message across the Legion Hall. So when Darryl Gribbs, the owner of the hall, had arrived to find him finishing up the last letter, he had called the cops and held him there until they arrived. Mark was on the football team, big even for a 13-year-old. But Daryl had been to Vietnam and was not about to let some pup ruin his place and get away with it. Thanks to Daryl and the persuasive nature of this jack-o'-lantern kid, they now had something to go by. "Yeah, I don't know, Travis. This all just sounds like bullshit to me." "How so?" Travis asked, legitimately taken aback. Both kids identified this other kid, down to the headgear. "Yeah, then they committed vandalism. Who cares about this pumpkin kid? We have the perpetrator. That's all I care about. And if he convinces more kids to do the same?" Sheriff Carl shrugged. "Then I hope their parents have some deep pockets too. It's just Halloween hellin', Travis. It happens every year. This is no different." Travis wanted to believe that, but somehow it didn't feel like the normal degree of pranks and tricks. This seems different, boss. This isn't the... He felt a strange sense of deja vu as someone interrupted him with a less than gentle knock. "Sheriff," Sullivan said on the other side, "you might want to see this." "What is it, Sully?" Carl asked, his brow knitting together a little as he came ponderously out of his chair. "Come out front. It appears there's been another tagging." Travis followed behind the sheriff's ponderous gait, and the two of them discovered what Sullivan was talking about together. Someone had spray-painted "The Green Man Lives" across the front of the station in large, smeary green letters. As the three of them stood there, taking it all in, Travis saw some of the sheriff's ambivalence drain away. "I want the camera footage from the front of the station on my desk as soon as possible. Travis, go ahead and put out an APB on this Pumpkinhead kid. If he's responsible for this crap, I want it to stop. This just became very personal." He waddled back in then, and Travis sighed as he looked at the runny message that lay across the bricks of the small police station. He hated Halloween, but this year felt different. As the hair on the back of his neck prickled, Travis couldn't help but look around, expecting to see a little jack-o'-lantern hiding somewhere nearby. This year, it seemed, the tricks would come before the treats. "I heard he's been meeting people in the park so he can ask them to do favors. They say he grants wishes, and if you do him a favor, he'll give you whatever you want. He's been telling people about the Green Man and converting people to his religion. He's a ghost, and he only comes out on Halloween to play pranks on people. He doesn't have a head underneath that pumpkin, and he's trying to steal other people's heads." Travis looked over the notes he had and realized there was likely nothing usable here. Sheriff Carl had advised him to question the younger students about this pumpkin-headed boy, and the reports were as scattered as they were inconsistent. This was indicative of questioning children, but Travis did feel as if he had a few solid leads. He had sussed out the breadcrumbs from the ants, but the crumbs were about as helpful as the actual information. First and foremost, the pumpkin boy did not attend school with them. To their knowledge, he didn't attend school at all, though he had been seen there. He mostly met kids in the park, which was where he recruited them into whatever it was he was doing. Most of them said he took kids into the big hedge to meet them there, but others said it was the old playground behind the new park, where he met with his potential victims. Second was that Pastor Marley had been searching for him too. Most of the kids said that Officer Travis wasn't the first one to ask them about the pumpkin kid. Pastor Marley had become very interested in him and wanted to discover where he could be found. The kids didn't know why he wanted to find the pumpkin kid so badly, but he had been seen haunting many of the same places that the boy had been seen in. Then there were the rumors of the family with the pumpkins for heads as well. They had been wearing them for as long as anyone could remember, and they lived secluded on the outskirts of town. No one had really taken notice of them until now. They were an oddity to be speculated about, but nothing else. Now, there seemed to be some unsettling parallels between them and the ghost boy with the jack-o'-lantern for a head. "Sheriff ain't gonna like it," Gibbs said as he climbed into the passenger seat. Travis shrugged. They had interviewed about 50 kids from grades K to 12, and they had heard a mostly cohesive story. The pumpkin kid was an enigma, a spook, but he was a ghost that others had apparently seen. So, he was either a very convincing bit of urban legend, or he had to be real. Travis wasn't sure which one he liked less. "I doubt he will," he commented as he buckled and started the cruiser. Their police cruiser was an old Crown Victorian that had served in 4 different tours in as many departments. He and Gibbs had named her Trigger, but they were trying to take it as easy on the old girl as possible. As hard as it may be to believe, there weren't a lot of high-speed chases in Frazier, and not a lot of shootouts with drug smugglers or bootleggers either. Trigger had about as quiet a life as her riders, of which they were all glad. "Well, what should we do?" Gibbs asked. "Well, some of the kids say there's a family of pumpkin heads in town, apparently. You know anything about that? 'Cause it's news to me." Gibbs scratched his head. "I've heard rumors, but most of it's just hearsay. They say Worley delivers groceries out to the old steel place, the farm out behind the Stutter farm, and that he's trucked with the patriarch who wears a pumpkin on his head." "Any truth to it, you think?" Travis asked skeptically. Gibbs just shrugged. "Well, it's a start, I guess. Let's..." But before Travis could answer, the radio crackled to life as dispatch came over the wire. Car 2, come in." Travis looked at the headset, not really wanting to pick it up. It felt like it held ominous portents in that crackle. Gibbs rolled his eyes and picked it up. "Car 2, go ahead, Cheryl." "Be advised, we have a call from the Stutter farm that needs attention." Travis was pulling out into the road, knowing it wouldn't do any good to dilly-dally. 10-4, what's the nature of the disturbance?" "Vandalism. No need to run the lights, but Darryl Stutter's pretty upset about the whole thing." Gibbs told her they were on their way and hung up the headset. Travis and his partner were the only 2 officers on duty that day. Sheffield was at a doctor's appointment, and Sheriff Carl was working at the office on paperwork for the upcoming audit. They were spearheading this pumpkin kid investigation, mostly to make sure it wasn't an urban legend, and the more they looked into it, the less and more Travis believed it. "I knew I should have stayed in bed today," Travis growled to himself. "Look on the bright side. At least when we get done at Stutter's, we can go check on these pumpkin heads that live at the old steel place." Travis nodded. That was indeed a consolation prize. "Everything was fine when I went to bed last night. Then I come out here today to get them pumpkins ready for the patch tomorrow, and I find this." Darryl Stutter was beside himself as he stood with Travis and Gibbs in his south field, and for good reason. Stutter Farm was one of 5 large farms in the area, and Stutter was known for his pumpkins. Said pumpkins, about 50 in all, though almost 25 were likely damaged beyond salvaging, were now mostly spread across the field. It was a real horror show. Pumpkin innards and orange gourd flesh splattered everywhere, and Travis hated to see it almost as much as the farmer did. This was farmers market country, produce standia, and messing with people's crops was tantamount to murder in their eyes. If Stutter had heard whatever hoodlums had been out there messing with his patch, Travis had little doubt that he'd be coming back to clean up the remains of people, as opposed to produce. "What time would you say you came out to the field, Darryl?" Travis asked, Gibbs looking around for anything they might could use in their report. "Probably about 8, Farmer Stutter said after some thought. "Had to finish with the milking first and hunt up a lost goat, but I reported it no later than 8:30 this morning," he said, and Travis didn't miss the barb. It was nearly noon now, and his pumpkins had been sitting out here waiting for nearly 4 hours. Perhaps the Comet would have something to write about after all. Something about police negligence, Travis was almost certain. Sorry, Daryl. We've been investigating something else this morning.
Well, that's great. I'm glad my tax dollars don't make me a priority or anything.
Travis had to stop himself from rolling his eyes, but it was a near thing. Let me go see if Officer Gibbs has found anything, and we'll get back with you. In the meantime, we'll file this with the sheriff, so hopefully we can find those responsible, and you can get compensated for your pumpkins.
I'll just make myself comfortable by the phone then, shall I?
Farmer Stutter said, stomping into the field as he began searching for salvageable produce. Travis watched him go, really wanting to bounce the notepad he'd been making notes on off the back of the ornery farmer's skull. Instead, he made his way over to Gibbs as he crouched beside something near the fence line. "What you thinking?" Travis asked, pitching his voice low as Daryl skulked nearby.
"I think it's a waste of pumpkins," Gibbs said dryly,
"but I also suspect that our initial problems might be connected to it." Travis raised an eye. "What, you think kids came out here and did this?" Gibbs nodded. "Yep, sure do." "What do you base that on?"
"Well, all them pumpkins looked like they were caved in with bats, or maybe crowbars. Something swung one-handed. That being said, their damage isn't real bad. Most of the scatter is because they threw a few of them, not because they whacked them too hard. Whoever hit them wasn't going for RBIs, they just wanted them unusable."
"Unusable for what?" Travis asked,
but Gibbs only shrugged. "For anything, I reckon."
"Uh-huh. Anything else, Columbo?" Travis asked.
"Just this."
Gibbs was pointing to tracks in the dirt. There were shoe prints in the powdery soil, that was true, but what Travis was looking at was a bike tread. One or two of them had pushed their bikes through the hole in the pasture fence, the one that made it easy for people to come through when they held the pumpkin patch, and as they followed them back to the road, Travis was unsurprised to find more tracks by the concrete. The tracks headed back into town, or from town, though Travis assumed the trails would be intertwined by now. "Not good," Travis breathed, Gibbs nodding as the two looked back in the direction the tracks were heading. "It's shaping up to be the worst week in Fraziers that I've seen in a while." Daryl Stutter rolled his eyes when they said they'd bring their report to the sheriff, saying he hoped the old man would get off his ass and put some effort into this one. Travis, again, resisted the urge to slap the taste out of his mouth and climbed into the car as Gibbs hopped into the shotgun seat. "Shouldn't we be heading back?" Gibbs asked, as they turned left instead of heading into town. "You forget already? We got a date with some pumpkin heads, remember?"
"Nothing,"
Gibbs growled as he slouched back towards the cruiser.
"Nothing?"
Travis asked, his butt getting warm as he sat on the hood of the cruiser.
"Well, not nothing, but no pumpkin heads. There's some animals in the barn, some crops in the little field, but nobody around to tend them, at least not that I've seen."
Travis sighed. He might have expected as much. They had pulled up in the little farm, the one that had once been inhabited by a family named Steele back 100 years ago, and found a modest farm with a barn and a small field. They had seen the smoke from the chimney and expected to be greeted at the door, as was the custom, but they had knocked 7 or 8 times to no avail. No one had come out to see what they wanted, or offer them a cold glass of tea, or suggest any sort of vulgar acts that they could accomplish by themselves. Gibbs had gone out to check the barn and the field, while Travis had sat and watched the house, but not a curtain had rustled or a face appeared to peek at them the whole time they were there. Someone lived there, all right. That much was certain, and whoever it was did not like guests. "They must be out," Gibbs said, climbing into the cruiser as he bent down to pick burdocks off his pants cuffs. "We'll just have to come back, I guess." "Yeah," Travis said, though he doubted it would change much. They could come back every day till New Year and still find not a soul. It wasn't until he was putting the cruiser in drive that he looked over and saw what he'd been waiting for. He had to double-take, certain that he had seen the pumpkin head in the small basement window of the farmhouse. But when he looked again, there was nothing but dust. "What's up?" Gibbs asked, looking where he was looking. "See something?" Travis looked for another count of 5 before shaking his head. "Nah, wishful thinking, I guess." He pulled away from the house, but he knew it had been a bit more than his imagination. Travis and Gibbs stood before the desk, waiting for the sheriff's assessment of their findings. They had brought their report to Sheriff Carl, and the old gray-haired cop looked over them with a less-than-pleased eye. Carl Hashwin, the sheriff over the 5 or 6 officers in Frazier, had once been a lineman for Georgia Tech, but had resigned himself to police work after being passed over by the NFL for the 3rd year in a row. He'd been a decent football player, but as a sheriff, he brought something to the town it had never had. Those who knew Sheriff Carl knew that he wasn't a brute or a big-bellied club swinger like his predecessors. He was an understanding and often slightly progressive community figure, and despite the weight he'd put on in the 10 years that he'd been sheriff, Carl was still capable of exacting change in the hometown that he loved so much. Now, however, he looked troubled. "I don't suppose we have any video evidence that local kids hit Darryl Studda's pumpkins, do we?" "No, sir. Unfortunately, the bank cameras don't have quite the range for that." Sheriff Carl snorted. "That's good, Parks. You ought to take that up to Grace's on Saturday and see how it flies at the open mic. In the meantime, do either of you have anything concrete we can use to link this?" He held up the report from the Studder farm. "To this," he said, shaking the folder that contained the other vandalism cases. Travis looked at Gibbs, and the two shared a long look. "Not as such, Sheriff, but it seems pretty convenient that the kids decided to vandalize a bunch of local businesses on the same week that a bunch of pumpkins get busted up. We can prove they rode bikes, which is something a bunch of kids would do, but we don't have anything concrete yet." The sheriff furrowed his brow, looking at the reports again before sighing deeply. "Then you'll have to find some. Show me a link between all of this, and we can begin hunting up perpetrators. Till then, we can't connect the two, and Darryl will just have to mourn the loss of his gourd flesh without compensation." Travis sighed, but nodded. He had expected as much. "In the meantime, why not go and talk to the pastor about this pumpkin-headed kid he's interested in? Sounds like he's working the same trail you are, so maybe he's got some information. If one of you thinks you can stake out the park and catch this pumpkin kid making deals with other kids, then be my guest. If this pumpkin boy is the ringleader, then we need to get him out of the equation. What you have is a start, boys, but you need more." Gibbs and Travis left the office a few minutes later, after being dismissed. As the door closed, Gibbs glanced at Travis and grinned as he set his fist into his flattened palm. "Rock, paper, scissors to see who's got to go talk to the minister." Travis thought about it, his hand slowly coming up to the ready action. The thought of staking out Rutherford Park in late October, as the first fingers of icy wind came rattling off the plains, was less than exciting, and as they pounded out the start of their first throw, Travis felt the chill of the bursted heater and trigger already. Today, however, the universe decided to be merciful. Gibbs groaned as Travis's paper covered his rock, and Gibbs went off to search the park as Travis left on foot for the Baptist church. It appeared he had a meeting with Pastor Marley. The United Baptist Hall of Frazier had stood since before Travis was a twinkling in his father's eye, but the white brick building was no less welcoming than it always was as Travis walked up the steps. He stopped before going into the doors, looking at the ghost of a spray-painted message beside them. Had Pastor Marley maybe been having some trouble with vandals too, And forgotten to report it? Travis wondered. It would give him something else to ask, he supposed. It had been a while since he'd been here. Easter service, he supposed, but he remembered the layout from his youth well enough. Pastor Marley was always here, taking up residence inside the living quarters above the church, and when Travis came in, he was replacing candles in the chandelier of the worship hall. He looked very small as he stood on the tall ladder, putting the candle stubs in his pocket as he replaced them with fresh candles from the other. He smiled down at Travis as he came shakily down the great ladder, extending a strong, leathery hand for him to shake. Pastor Marley was pushing 60 if he was a day, but when you shook his hand and felt the pump of his strong arm, you believed the rumors that he'd once been a sergeant in the Marines. "Welcome, my son. What brings you to God's house today?" "Well, sir, I was hoping maybe you could help me with something." Pastor Marley invited him into his study, so they could speak on it privately, and as the white-haired man sat smiling across from him, Travis pulled out his notes. "Doubtless you've heard about the slew of vandalism cases around town." "I have. I, too, have come in for some graffiti, though. I've cleaned it up myself and gone along with my day." "Well, we have reason to believe that a single perpetrator is responsible for these things, and it's an individual you've also been searching for." The pastor nodded, not even attempting to evade the question, which was refreshing for someone in Travis's line of work. "You're talking about the pumpkin-headed child?" Travis nodded. "We've heard you're looking for him, too. Any particular reason why?" The pastor seemed to contemplate the best way to answer the question. "I like to walk in the evenings, officer. My walk often takes me from the church to Rutherford Park, where I sit for a spell before continuing on. It's a nice park. At least it was. A few nights ago, I saw a strange child near the old playground. He was surrounded by other children, and I went to make sure he wasn't being bullied. They had him ringed in, and I feared he might be the subject of their aggression before I got closer. I heard him telling them about someone I hadn't heard spoken of in years, the Green Man. He was also talking about the rewards for following his instructions. I called out to them then, wanting them to move away from the boy so I could talk to him, but when they dispersed, he was already gone. I've been looking for him ever since, hoping to stop him from leading others astray, but I sense that he knows I'm on the prod for him, and he's staying one step ahead of me." Travis was nodding as he made notes. "And what is this Green Man?" "Not what," Marley corrected. "Who. The Green Man is one of those old pagan deities. I heard about him when I was in Germany. Something the locals whisper about and make sacrifices to. I'd rather not talk about it. As it turns out, his followers were not as willing to live and let live as mine were. It was a terrible thing, and I still have nightmares about it sometimes. Things like that were part of the reason I left the service and joined the church. I wanted to feel like I was doing something to make things better for people. Turned out I wasn't as strong as I thought I was," he said, looking far away and sad. "And now he's come here?" Travis said, more to himself than anything. "It would seem so," the preacher said. "I'm just trying to do my part to make sure he doesn't corrupt the youth. The youth in this town have so few chances for success, and that kind of environment is a breeding ground for corruption. I'm just trying to keep the lambs on the straight and narrow." Travis snorted. "And they told me that Frazier was too small for gang activity to be an issue. But looks like we have our first turf war after all." The holy man smiled, but there was no real mirth in it. "The entirety of creation is one big turf war between good and evil, Officer Parks. I would think an
enforcer of the law would know that better than anyone."
Travis took his leave soon after that, making his way on foot to the park. It was just after lunch. Another 5 hours separated him from the free world, and he was hoping for something to take him back to the sheriff before quitting time. Turns out he'd get his wish, and more than he was bargaining for. The old preacher watched him go from the front window. The police had finally taken notice then. That was good. Marley was not a young man, and if the police were willing to take this burden from him, he would give it over happily. He had survived the Green Man once, survived and paid a terrible price for that survival. It had cost him his flock, his church, nearly cost him his faith. He had fled the continent to get away from that old devil, and now it had found him again. Marley shook the thought away.
"They'll stop him," he said,
hearing his own voice so full of desperate hope.
"They'll stop it from happening here."
He picked up the bag of trash from his study and moved to the dumpster. He had service tonight, and he still needed to go over the Bible study for the evening. Sometimes, he reflected, it was easier to be a Protestant than it had ever been to be a Catholic. The ceremonies, the pageantry, the rituals, they all got in the way of service sometimes. He had never felt any more holy in his vestments than he had in his polo shirts and suit pants. He was making a difference here in Frazier, and that was fine with him. He had tossed the trash and turned to come back inside when he saw the hateful message on the back of his beloved church. "Your days are numbered, priest. All hail the Green Man." Marley glowered at it for several minutes before turning to the shed to get the paint. This would need to be covered before his flock arrived. "Seen anything, partner?" Travis asked, and smiled when Gibbs tensed. Gibbs had posted up on a nearby park bench that overlooked the playground and most of the walking track. That being said, he was also snoring softly by the time Travis got there, and he looked guiltily at his partner as he came awake. The park wasn't terribly busy. Middle school hadn't even gotten out yet, and as Travis took a seat, Gibbs tried to shoo him away.
"Hey, budge off. You're gonna blow my cover."
Gibbs had traded his uniform for some jeans and a windbreaker, the ball cap he wore pulled down over his thick blonde hair, but no local would have been fooled. Gibbs looked like Gibbs, and everyone in town recognized one of the 7 faces in uniform they might have to depend on in an emergency. At best, someone might think he was an out-of-towner, but only till they got close. "Gibbs, I don't think anybody's going to be fooled by your civvies." Gibbs had opened his mouth to answer, with something biting, no doubt, but about that time, Mrs. Banks jogged past and greeted both of them by name. "Good to see you two are getting some sun," she joked, the older woman brown as a nut. Mrs. Banks was the postmaster for all of Frazier, and she usually ended up running the route herself. This wasn't a tall order in Frazier, and she got a lot of sun by taking the mail on foot. As she jogged past in her purple shorts and stretchy top, Travis hoped he looked that good when he was staring 60 right in the face.
"Okay," Gibbs said, putting the hat in his lap. "Just wanted to feel like a real detective for once. Thought undercover work might be fun, but I guess it was dull as most things are around here."
Travis nodded, looking out over the tykes playing on the jungle gym with some jealousy. "Well, part of the problem is you're at the wrong playground." Gibbs looked lost. "Huh?" "All the kids we've talked to have flat out said that it's the old one behind the big hedge, remember?" Gibbs stared into nothing for a minute before slapping his forehead hard enough to make some of the accompanying parents look up.
"Damn, you're right. I completely forgot about that. I guess we should stake out the creepy old wooden one then, huh?"
Travis got up. "Seems that way. Here, you take the left jogging path, I'll take the right. We'll keep eyes on both sides and hopefully find something worthwhile." Gibbs got up, nodding as he brushed the non-existent dirt off his pants.
"Doesn't seem any more likely that we'll find anything out here either. Kids don't go to the old playground if they can help it."
"Apparently one does, and that's the one that we're after.
"Come on. Quick as started, quick as finished," he said, and the two headed off in opposite directions. Travis reflected on what Gibbs had said as he made his way around the walking track. Kids didn't often go to the old playground, and if they did, it was to tell spooky stories or to scare each other in less creative ways. You could almost tell where the new park ended and the old park began. It was like the groundskeepers had made an invisible line where the mowers stopped and the weed eaters never came, and the grass here was yellow and in a state of dishevelment. The picnic tables here were splintery and covered in graffiti and cigarette butts. The high schoolers were not as easily scared off by ghost stories and disrepair. Travis had come out here at dusk more than once to run off necking or drunk teens. No one cared what went on in the old section of Rutherford Park, and it was only a matter of time before someone got the funding to put a soccer field or a baseball field in the spot and ended the old space for good. Travis looked at the hedge as he came up and thought they might have a time getting rid of it. The hedge was a landmark within the park and the last vestiges of the old hedge maze that had once been there. It was close on 9 feet tall and cut another 20 feet off the old park from view. The roots on that thing were likely deep, and it would take more than one cutting to extinguish them when the time came. It seemed to loom over Travis like a giant, and he imagined that it would be daunting for a child as he stood looking up at it. He came around the side of it and found the old playground waiting beyond. The new play area had a metal play structure, a jungle gym, a new swing set, and several of those plastic animals on springs, all set into the bouncy rubber ground that would stop the kiddies from cracking their skulls open if they fell. The old playground had none of the metal constructs the new one held. The old spot was all soft wood and delicate constructs, looking like a castle with climbing walls and hanging bridges. The swings mostly hung on broken chains now, the slide nearly rusted through, and the ground was a quagmire of old wood chips that were as likely to hide a snake as a toy. It made Travis sad to see this much-loved place in such a state. How many times had he and his friends played here on summer days or after school, or with sparklers in hands as they stood in the tower and watched 4th of July fireworks? Too many to count, he thought, and seeing the place like this made him miss his friends that he'd had when he was young. Their faces and names had faded now, all of them leaving after graduation as quickly as they could. Travis had stayed, though, wanting to make a difference in a place he loved, and as he walked towards the structure, he wondered if he had made the right decision. When he saw the flash of orange go by, he thought he might be seeing things for half a heartbeat. When the kid with the pumpkin on his head jumped down from the structure and made his way out of the playground, throwing a backpack over his shoulder, Travis realized what he was really seeing. The kid was in no hurry. He wasn't running, and Travis thought for a second that maybe he hadn't even seen him. The kid was heading towards the woods, heading out of the park, heading towards the farmland, and Travis was worried that his opportunity might pass while he just stood here gawping at him. "Hey," he called, breaking into a run as the kid glanced behind him and broke into a sprint. Travis was about 90 feet from the kid when he'd seen him, but no matter how well his long legs ate up the ground, he never seemed to get any closer. The kid should have been slowed down by the ankle-deep grass he plunged into as he came to the back of the park, but no such luck. He ran in, heedless of the perils within, and Travis paused at the edge of the path as he watched him go. This time of year it would be easy to step on a cottonmouth or come down on a bunch of ground wasps before the first real freeze of winter could put both of them to ground for a while. The kid disappeared into the back of the grass area, and when Travis heard footsteps grating on the sidewalk, he turned and dropped a hand to his service revolver. Gibbs was out of breath when he came up and never noticed the hand his partner had put on his piece. What happened? I saw you run off, but I didn't... What did... He dropped onto his butt on the sidewalk and couldn't seem to find his breath as he panted. It was him, Travis said,
also out of breath, but handling it better. It was the kid with the pumpkin head. You sure? Gibbs said, as he teetered on the verge of hyperventilation. How many other kids could it have been with a pumpkin on their head? Gibbs shrugged. Hopefully not many, or this could be harder than I thought. Travis turned back, and that's when he saw the brat sitting at the edge of the grass and looking at them. The orange stood out against the pines and the birches, and it took everything he had to turn away and head back to the cruiser. It wouldn't do any good to chase this kid through the wood. He'd get him. It was only a matter of time. This is getting ridiculous, Carl. I'm out 50 pumpkins now, and my neighbor is out about 30. This is becoming a problem, Sheriff. What do you intend to do about it? Travis had been coming in for his shift the next day when he found Sheriff Carl already meeting with Farmer Stutter in his office. The man had fresh mud on his pant cuffs, and he was doing his best to menace the old sheriff, who looked like a bulldog suffering a terrier. The man was mad about his crops, that much was apparent, but Travis wasn't sure what he wanted him to do about it. Defense of the homestead had always been for the farmers and their hands to handle, not like it had ever really been an issue since the Depression. Are you finished, Darrell? Darrell Stutter looked at the old man like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. What? I asked if you were done puffing your chest and were ready to hear what I had to say. Carl took advantage of the shocked silence. I'll have Gage and Dreyfus make regular patrols by the farm until further notice. In meantime, I'll make it known that anyone we catch helling in the farmlands will be fined heavily for the produce they destroy. Get your hands to move the produce you don't want to risk into your barn, and make sure they stay the night to watch your fence line. At this point, if you end up shooting one of these kids, it isn't like we can really hold it against you. That seemed to get through to the farmer. Jesus, Carl, town had probably run me out on a rail if I blasted some kid. Defense of the farms has always been on the farmers, Darrell. Your forefathers didn't want the law telling them how they could and couldn't protect themselves from tramps. But now, suddenly, you want our help. Either accept my help or continue to do it yourself. Either way, get out of my office and stop acting like I owe you something. I have officers working this case, and I'm doing all I can. I really don't appreciate you acting like I'm sitting here twiddling my thumbs. Farmer Stutter seemed unsure whether to fish or cut bait, and opted to leave instead. Travis watched him go before leaning against the doorway as Sheriff Carl blew on his coffee. I take it our mystery vandal struck again last night. Carl didn't answer for a few minutes, and when he did, Travis felt a little guilty for ribbing him. He sounded older, more tired than usual. Yes, and not just the Stutter farm either. Ranners and Jarvis left messages with night dispatch, and Gage and Dreyfus said it was the busiest night they'd had in a long time. $2,000 worth of produce smashed in the field, and no one knows why. Is there a pattern to all this? Travis asked, looking up as Gibbs blundered in with a breakfast sandwich clamped in his teeth. Yeah, but it's not definitive. Travis waited, and when it became clear he wasn't going to leave, Carl continued. They've wrecked other things, but the majority of the carnage is always pumpkins. For some reason, whoever's doing this really doesn't like pumpkins. Travis couldn't help but think of the little pumpkin kid he'd seen yesterday, and he wondered how someone so young could be at the center of all this. They leave any new graffiti behind? Travis asked, on a hunch. Carl made a sour face. More of the same. It's all green man this and pumpkin child that. They leave it in orange and green, but last night's tagging was harder to explain. Why's that? Travis asked, Gibbs coming up behind him as he straightened his uniform shirt. 'Cause it was damn near 15 feet up the side of Farmer Stutter's freshly painted barn. He tossed an envelope to Travis then, the front bearing the shaky handwriting that usually marked the evidence bags you saw him holding. That's a
List of people I'd like you two to interview today. Most of them are within town lines, so I didn't figure it would take you long."
Travis nodded. "We're on it, Sheriff."
"Parks,"
he said, wheeling Travis back around as he turned to go.
"I want this closed soon. This is the sort of thing people remember come election time, and I've become very comfortable behind this desk. Help me stay here, and I'll remember it when it comes time for raises. Understood?"
"Gotcha, boss," Travis promised, turning to go as Gibbs fell in with him. It was time to get back to work. "What if the Green Man is more to do with them than we think?" Gibbs asked as they left Roanoke Middle School. "Like, maybe it's some kind of cult or something." Travis sighed as he dragged another line across his latest hypothesis. "That would actually make this a lot easier, Gibbs. If we could chalk this up as a cult or something, some kind of huckster that's directing this pumpkin kid, then it would make things a whole hell of a lot easier to figure out." They had interviewed about 20 kids today, another 10 adults that worked at the 3 schools in Frazier. Travis suspected a few of them, especially the boy who'd come in with green paint still on his hands, but most of them had been dead ends or had good alibis. Travis had been kicking around the idea of some kind of subliminal interaction, maybe even some kind of group delusion, but these kids were likely to be missed if they just up and disappeared in the middle of the night. The high schoolers seemed unlikely to waste their time with something like this, but by the end, Travis found himself more interested in the adults that had come with them than the children. The English teacher, Mrs. Hobbs, had insisted on staying with the middle school students that Travis interviewed, saying they deserved someone in their corner to make them feel comfortable. Travis was all for advocacy, but she seemed to be trying to lead a few of the students in certain directions when it came to the questions. At the elementary school, it had been Mr. French, who had taught 5th grade since Travis was a kid, and at the high school, it had been Mrs. Davies and Mr. Draper, both physical education teachers. He hadn't noticed the pins until Mrs. Hobbs, but he felt like Mr. French had had one too, and the coaches at the high school had definitely been wearing them. The round pin with a blue backing of a snowflake had been unique and had stood out against the jack-o'-lanterns and leaf pins they'd seen some of the others wearing. Some of the kids had been wearing them too, and when Travis asked Mrs. Davies about it, she had laughed and waved it off. They were just a popular fad at the moment, she said, and she had gotten one after seeing the kids wearing them. Walking through a group of girls that came up the steps, Travis definitely saw a few of them in evidence, but their meaning eluded him. "Think about it," Gibbs said, as they made their way to the parking lot to collect the cruiser. "Maybe this Green Man is like a cult leader or something. Small towns are always supposed to be good places for cults and predatory religious groups. This could be some kind of hostile takeover or encroachment or something." He elaborated as best he could, but Travis wasn't really listening as the cruiser came into sight. The flutter of paper from beneath the wiper blade had caught his eye, and he took it out as he squinted at the message that someone had left him. "Meet me at the parking lot of Kreitz. I want to help." Gibbs read the message over his shoulder, looking back at Travis questioningly. "Sounds like a trap," he said, looking around for people who were lurking. "Probably," Travis said, "but it's our best lead so far. Feel like catching some lunch at the Kreitz sandwich counter?" "I reckon," Gibbs said, sliding into the passenger seat as the two headed off to their next case, lunch and this mysterious informant. Sheriff Carl looked up when something hit the front of the station. It was around 1, and Molly was on her lunch break while Carl tried his best to sort out all this nonsense. He already missed the days when the worst he had to think about was arresting some farmer that the DA or the feds wanted for making too much moonshine or growing pot in their back field. Frazier was a quiet place, and the usual Halloween headache was little more than some light vandalism or some houses that needed to be cleaned up. This, however, was beginning to look like something else. This was beginning to resemble anarchy. Something thumped near the front door, but Carl shook it off and got back to work. It's probably the FedEx guy dropping off something anyway. If he needed to sign, he could wait till Molly got back. Carl was doing important work right now. There was a connection here. He could see it, but it was like trying to put a puzzle together without the box. He could see a picture forming, but it didn't mean anything to him. The pumpkins were part of it. The green man was a part of it. The kitties and the Pumpkinhead Kid and the messages on the wall, it was all a part of it. The problem was, Carl didn't know what it was. When he heard glass breaking, Carl jumped and threw his pen halfway across the room. It hadn't been the sound of glass shattering, but it had definitely been glass cracking. He got up and headed around the desk, feeling like someone woken up by pebbles against their window, and he stepped out to find a crack running through the glass of the sheriff's office front window, and 3 smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the stoop out front. He would have thought they were pumpkins, but the last one, the one that had made the crack, had left the imprint of a grinning orange splat on the surface. Carl walked out to find the sidewalk empty, but a sudden rustle to his left made him reach for his gun and swivel. It was a note stuck on the stem of one of the jack-o'-lanterns, and Carl reached for it with shaky hands as he lifted it off. "Stop meddling in our affairs and get out while you still can." "I'm getting too damn old for this shit," Carl said, looking out as if expecting to see a little pumpkin watching him from the shadows. Travis started to just leave when he watched the guy in the London fog come walking in. "Hell no," Gibbs said, picking up his tray and starting to leave. "Absolutely not. Sheriff Carl probably write us up just for being seen at the same lunch counter as this fella." Travis put a hand on his arm, and Gibbs looked at him skeptically as he sat back down. "Are you serious? After the story he wrote about you last 4th of July? Travis could feel his teeth groaning in his mouth as he gritted them. "I don't want to talk to Nathan Casterly any more than you do, but if he has information, then we need it." Nathan Casterly was not well liked around the bullpen, and with good reason. Casterly wrote for Fraziers' only newspaper, The Comet, and most of his stories were a little more sensational than was strictly needed in a town with 5 traffic lights. He wrote the sort of stories that you'd see in a big-time paper, things like City Hall scandals and incompetent leaders' exposés. His favorite subject lately had been the police department, and how they did little more than sit around like lazy hounds until it was time to break someone's skull open. He'd written up Travis last summer for harassment after his car had been towed during the 4th of July parade. He had left out the part about how his little coupe had been parked in a handicap spot, but the article had done little to hurt Travis's career, all told. Travis had his best stony expression prepared for the little paper pusher, but when he turned around to look for them, Travis could tell this wasn't the usual Nathan Casterly of times gone by. Nathan was a mess. His hair was disheveled, the bags under his eyes looked packed for a week-long stay, and he looked around fitfully as he went to sit with them. Travis had taken a booth away from the front window, and Nathan nodded as he took a seat. He glanced around again before settling in and thanking them for coming. "Yeah, well, if we'd known it was you who'd left the note." I know. I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, but this is serious." Gibbs rolled his eyes. "What's wrong, Nat? Some politician steal your girlfriend? Philandering and having bad taste in men ain't a crime." Nathan looked like he wanted to say something, but seemed to swallow it down with a mouthful of coffee. "Ha, this is important, and I know you two are working this case. I want to help, while I still can." Travis put a hand up as Gibbs took a breath to sally back with something cutting. "What do you know?" Nathan reached into his pocket and took out a manila envelope. "It's all there. I became aware of people in the woods about 2 weeks ago. Kind of thought it might be a cult. Cults are good for paper sales, especially this time of year. When I saw it was mostly kids going out there, I thought I had something interesting, especially when I saw whose kids it was. The usual troublemakers were there, the Cozy Boys and the Murphys, but Mayor Transdale's son was there too, as well as Selectman Miles's daughter and my editor's son. Not just kids either, but some of the stars of the local high school and some adults to boot. They all headed out down the access road right around sunset to meet at this weird pavilion that looks pretty new. There's an altar there, something I can't really describe, but they meet and hold a kind of mass for their green man, whoever he is." Travis had opened the envelope, and sure enough, Nathan had pictures of the meeting. They were grainy, most of them taken from a distance and enhanced a little, but they were there. Travis could see about 20 in all, mostly kids and teens, and a few of them were faces that he knew. The Cozy Boys, both out on bail, some kids Travis had talked to earlier today, and a few adults that he had seen too. Mr. Hobbs, Mrs. Davies, several other teachers from the school, and in the middle of it all was a shabby-looking kid with a pumpkin for a head. "When do they meet?" Travis asked, putting the pictures away before sliding the envelope between he and Gibbs. "Most every evening. I've only been out there about 3 times to see the gathering, but after the last one, I think someone saw me. I've seen people follow me, seen them look at me or ask me weird things like we're both in on a secret and I'd better keep it to myself. Someone smashed a pumpkin through my windshield this morning, and the note attached to it said I better get out while I can." Travis nodded. "So why go blabbing to the cops then?" Nathan made a disgusted noise. "Because I'm not going to run just because they say so. This is my town too. I grew up here just like both of you did, and I'm not going to abandon it. I know I'm a persona non grata at the station, but I need protection. I'm afraid that after I talk to you, they'll come after me. So, quid pro quo, fellas. I helped you. Now I need help." Travis looked at Gibbs. "What you say, partner? Think we can help him?" Gibbs nodded slowly. "Oh, I think we can make some arrangements, but they ain't gonna be too comfy." Nathan looked as if he might be regretting this, but he nodded anyway. A half hour later, Nathan Casterly was secured in a holding cell as a person of interest and a witness in an ongoing investigation. Sheriff Carl said they'd keep an eye on him, and as Gibbs and Travis left the station, Travis couldn't help but check the sun. It was about 3 hours before sunset, maybe enough time to get in position before the festivities began. "Feel like working a little overtime with me, partner?" he asked Gibbs. Gibbs only chuckled. "Suppose so. Wasn't like I had anything better to do tonight." Pastor Andre Marley knelt before the altar, praying to God for a bountiful harvest. "Lord, give me the strength to do what must be done, and the serenity to know when the time to strike comes. Protect me as I go about your works, and bring me safely back home again. Amen." Pastor Marley knew it was blasphemy, but he pressed his lips to the rosary before sliding it back into his pocket and moving to the rectory to get his tools. It was time to go to work. Pastor Andre Marley, once Father Andre Marley, had been a member of the Catholic Church since he was 17. He had taken his vows, been vested and consecrated, and had taken to church life well. He had a parish in Northern Europe, a little town on the French border, and that had been his first encounter with true evil. Marley went to his knees beside his bed, as he had done 1,000 times before, but reached beneath as he pulled out an unfinished wooden box. He had left the church, become a lapsed Catholic, but he couldn't bring himself to be rid of the trappings of his former life. The box was where he kept his robes, his collar, his tools of destruction. He placed the box on the bed, sliding out the robes and vestments as he made ready to do the Lord's work. He brought the robes to his nose, inhaling the smell of another life. Rose oil, sage, the oils he had anointed so many with, and the subtle smell of the host as it rose. He had loved his parish, and the parishioners had loved him as well. He had been a pillar of the community, the glue that so often held them together, but it hadn't stopped the incursion of evil in the end. It had been subtle at first. They had hidden in the places where the weakest and most easily corrupted hid, and by the time they moved on to those who might be missed, it was too late. Marley had tried to save them, tried to keep them away from the church, but in the end, he had failed and been forced into exile. The church had not ostracized him. They had celebrated his work and told him that he had fought against evil as hard as any of them, but Marley had known better. He had gotten lax in his efforts, or so he believed, and his flock had paid the price. He had cast himself out and gone as far from the influence of the green man as he could. The robes still fit, and he slid the holy water and the vessel for the host into his pocket before sliding the familiar stole around his neck. It had been a long time since he'd worn them, 15 years at least, but they fit just the same. It always made him feel powerful to wear the vestment of his faith, and if he died tonight, he hoped he would lay forever in them, wherever it was that he fell. He walked out of the rectory, sliding his hands along the smooth walls of the church for what could be the last time. The church had been his home for the last 5 years, and it was one of the best houses of God that he had found himself in since his conversion. He had wallowed in his exile for quite some time when he had first left the faith, and going amongst the Protestants had seemed a fitting punishment for his transgressions. What he had found, however, was that they really weren't so different than his Catholic brothers. Some were good, some were bad, but they all held to their faith fiercely and clung to it tightest in times of need. As he went into the garage and slid behind the wheel of his Ford Ranger, he hoped he would see this place again, though he felt a aching knowledge in his guts that he wouldn't be back here. He hadn't been able to fight the Green Man when he was younger, but he could fight him now. He would be damned if he let the town fall to the false prophet, and by the end of the evening, Marley would know whether damnation was something that was in the cards for him or not. "This idea seems less advisable the longer we go on about it," Gibbs said, as the two of them stalked through the woods at dusk. "Then go back if that's what you want," Travis said, keeping low as he tried to keep the limbs from grabbing at him. "Shoot, just 'cause it's a bad idea doesn't mean I'm not going to see it through." They'd come to the end of the road just before sunset, and had parked the cruiser a little way down so they could walk up. Badges or not, it seemed like a bad idea to just head up to a place where you suspected they might be hosting a gathering of hellions and start trying to arrest people. As they came up through the woods, they crouched more than once as headlights passed by. People were heading towards whatever it was that was at the end of the access road, and Travis meant to find out if it was the group that he had been looking for. "What are we going to do once we get there?" Gibbs asked, the setting sun making the slight glow on the horizon all the more ominous. Something was brewing up the way, and Travis was afraid of what they might be seeking. "I guess we'll call it in," he said. "Guess if we can get Gage and Dreyfus up here, we can start making some arrests. If we call Sheriff Carl, he might even wake up everyone and get the full brunt of the police force down here to round everybody up." Gibbs nodded, the logic pretty sound, but Travis knew tonight would be mostly recon. Tonight would be a lot of writing down tag numbers and studying faces from the tree line so that they could ambush people in the light and get some answers. Tonight would be about escaping with their knowledge so they could unravel this case away from the danger of a group of hellions. "You hear that?" Gibbs whispered, pricking his ears like a dog who's heard a rabbit. Travis listened, and finally he picked it out from the sound of frogs and crickets. It was the tock, tock, tock of hard heels on rock. "Get low," Travis whispered, both of them crouching in the scraggy trees. Gibbs had his gun out, something Travis hadn't quite dared, and as the footsteps came up the road, he saw the silhouette of a man in long robes. He was walking determinedly up the center of the road, his hands shoved into his pockets, and as he passed them, Travis got a good look at his face in the rich, dying light of the day. Is that Pastor Marley?" Travis stage whispered, as the man moved up the road and clear of earshot. "Looked like. Where do you think he's heading?" Travis watched as the black-robed man made his way up the road, nearly invisible amidst the dying light. "Same place we're going, it looks like. Come on, he might need help." They went a little quicker now, their recon possibly turning into a backup operation. Wherever the preacher was going, he looked ready for a fight, and Travis hoped he was ready for whatever was waiting for him up ahead. Marley had parked his car near the end of the road and sat behind the wheel preparing for a few minutes. He prayed again for strength, for peace, for the serenity to use the gifts God might give him. This could be the end of him, he knew that, but doing nothing would be the end of his faith, and that was unacceptable. He'd given up his faith once. He was not in such a hurry to cast it aside again. The police had become aware of the pumpkin boy less than a week ago, but Marley had been keeping tabs on him for closer to 2. It had all begun when Mrs. Cortez, one of his parishioners who had come to him with concerns about her grandson. Mrs. Cortez, like him, was a lapsed Catholic who had found a home with the local Baptists. Her grandson, David, had fallen in with a bad crowd, and when she had said as much to Marley, he had laughed without meaning to. "In Frazier, I can't see a gang hiding much here." "Well, not a gang per se," she said, seeming unsure. "He leaves in the night when he thinks everyone's asleep and comes back early the next morning." David, the boy in question, was 11, and Marley thought it unlikely he was simply going out into the night. "Is this the same David that needed to be picked up early from the retreat 2 years ago because he was afraid of the dark?" Miss Cortez had furrowed her brow, believing she was being mocked, and Marley softened as he changed gears. "I'm sorry, Miss Cortez. I didn't mean to make light of your situation. I'll say a prayer for him, and unless you'd like me to speak with him, I'm not sure he'd take an old preacher any more seriously than his own grandmother, but I will try." "Would you?" she said, brightening. "It might make a world of difference. I just don't want him to get mixed up in something that will end badly for him. It's why I sent his mother to live with her sister, so she wouldn't fall in with a bad crowd. I'd hate for my grandson to make the mistake that I took out of his mother's path." Marley had said he would, but what he found when he went to the park to speak with David was far worse. His grandmother had told Marley that David liked to hang out with his friends after school at Rutherford Park, but when he went to wait for him, he saw another group approaching the hedge, and that was his first glimpse of the strange pumpkin child. At first he had worried that the group of much bigger boys meant to hurt him, the child with the pumpkin on his head being much smaller than they were. But when they showed the boy deference, Bending to speak with him in respect, he watched the group step into the hedge and disappear from view. That was the start of his surveillance, but it certainly wasn't the end. Pastor Marley felt the clock of his heels on the hard stone, and the firm smack of soles gave him confidence. It was the stability that he'd been looking for, and he had missed it in the years that had passed. When the missionaries and the speakers for the green men had invaded his town, he had ignored them. They were just travelers, passing through and speaking of strange ideas. But he wouldn't let them pass this time. He would save this town, the way he hadn't saved his first flock, and atone for the sins of his past. He had watched the hedge for the next few days, keeping an eye peeled for more activity. He couldn't have explained why, but he knew there was something strange going on. This whole thing seemed off, and Marley wanted to know why. He kind of thought it might be drugs at first. This was the farm belt after all, and meth wasn't out of the question. Like Miss Cortez, he thought some gang from a nearby town had set up shop and was using the impressionable kids to do their dirty work. He went right on thinking that, until the graffiti started appearing. Marley had been walking home from the corner store when he'd seen the green and orange missive scrawled across the front of the old warehouse where the kids sometimes played stickball. "All Hal the Green Man," it had said, the letters runny and barely legible. Anyone else would have passed it off as simple tagging, but Pastor Marley hadn't even noticed when the bags in his hands had landed on the ground. His eggs had smashed, his creamer leaking out impotently, but he could do nothing but stand and stare. It was like seeing an old enemy across the years and miles, and knowing a dread you hadn't felt since you were young. The Green Man was here now, and Marley was afraid that it might already be too late. The road ended abruptly, his confident heels sinking into the dirt of a country road, but it didn't slow the priest in the least bit. He could see some kind of rude structure ahead, and within it were gathered a collective of adults and children. They were holding torches, the bonfire behind the pavilion making the angles look almost natural. They were standing in an open-air hall, a raised dais letting them all hear what the little pumpkin kid had to say as he presided over them. The bonfire cast his shadow long across the ground, and as Marley came to the edge of the gathering, he felt the eyes of the child rest on him. No, not the kid's eyes. It was the eyes of the adversary. Beyond the bonfire was a blasphemous altar made of stone and odd geometry. It looked as if it had fallen from the heavens fully formed, and no hand had wrought such a thing as that. Within it was a small opening, like a viewing port for some terrible diorama, and Father Marley felt certain that this was where the heart of evil lay. This was the house where the enemy resided, and the taint would persist until it was closed. This was his target, but suddenly he felt more eyes than those of the enemy upon him. The pumpkin child's congregation had turned to look at him, and he felt his strength desert him for half a second. He was no Sampson, no David, and he could not hope to fight all of them. Much like Sampson, however, Marley thought that he could pull the temple down upon himself, if such was required. "I have come to put an end to your corruption of my town, and I will not stop until the Green Man is no more," he stated into the silence. "Jesus!" Gibbs breathed, watching the crowd shuffle in the wake of the priest's condemnation. "He's got stones, I'll give him that." "Yeah, but I think he may be about to lose them," Travis responded. "That crowd's 50 deep at the least. Few more than Nathan told us about. Couple of them are bigger than the little kids we came looking for, too." "I'll say. Are those the phys eds teachers from the high school? And that's Fred Masters from the hardware as well. Jupiter from the Fill and Go, and holy shit," he breathed, but Travis had already seen them. They had come in uniform, for God's sake, and the sight of Gage and Dreyfus complicated things some. "Did the sheriff know they were here?" Surely he wasn't involved in this too, or why would he have them investigate at all? No, Travis had to believe that Sheriff Carl wasn't wrapped up in this. Otherwise, the implications were that he wanted both of them gone, and Travis refused to believe it. They were standing at the edge of the woods, watching the priest as he squared off against the gathered throngs.
"What do we do now?"
asked Gibbs, and Travis could hear the rattle of his weapon.
"You need to go back and tell the sheriff what we've seen. I'll keep an eye on the preach and make sure he doesn't bite off more than he can chew." "Not a chance in hell," Gibbs said. "I'm not even sure the two of us can help the old preacher, let alone just you." "Yeah, and when we both get our fool selves killed, then who's gonna tell him what's going on out here?"
Gibbs smirked, shaking his head.
"Nah, you ain't getting rid of me that easy. Come on, partner. Let's go help the preach before he gets himself killed."
Travis wanted to rail at him, but he couldn't help but admire the man's courage. He wasn't sure that he'd be able to pass up an offer like that if it had come his way. Between them, they had about 24 rounds, and Travis was pretty sure there were at least twice that many on the pavilion. What's more, if his old pals still had their guns, then things could get messy. Gage was a better shot than Travis, and Dreyfus had been on the pistol team when he worked at the prison in Ledford. At the end of the day, he supposed it didn't really matter, though. Protect and serve and all that.
"Come on," Travis said, drawing his own gun. "Let's get this over with."
The kid with the jack-o'-lantern on his head had been talking about burning down the barn at the Stutter farm. Something about getting the last of the pumpkins before they moved on to the town, but he stopped talking when he saw the priest come into view. Was that fear Marley saw, or simply curiosity? It was hard to tell through the pumpkin head, and the closer he got to the dais, the more he began to doubt it was either. The closer he got, the more Marley came to doubt that whatever lay between that gourd could express much of anything, and the image gave him a shudder.
"In the name of God, I demand that you cease this communion with Satan. You've been swayed by evil, and I mean to see it brought to an end."
Father Marley had expected derision, perhaps scorn, but the gathered masses were deadly quiet. They turned to the child in eerie cohesion, and the boy looked back at him with wooden interest. The pumpkin boy was younger than Marley had at first guessed, and being this close made him think the kid might be even younger than that. He was small, 7 or 8 perhaps, but his childish hands moved masses, it seems. The hollow eyes of the pumpkin regarded him evenly, and Marley once again felt sure that they were hollow.
"We have no truck with your interloper, priest," said the pumpkin child, his cherubic voice sounding steady as he spoke from the dais. "No more than we have with your lamb god. Depart our company and cease your attempts to thwart the coming of winter, and we will allow you to leave in peace. For now."
Marley wasn't set back in the least, and as he walked amongst the parted flock of this pumpkin child, he felt like David amongst the lions. Of course he would say that he wasn't a tool of Satan. Few who served that imp said as much, and the interloper was present in many works. The idea that this green man might be something beyond his kin never occurred to him. In that moment, Father Marley was doing the Lord's work, and he meant to see it completed.
"Repent, child. It isn't too late. You have a demon in you, a demon that has infected these that you've gathered here as well. Repent and cast it aside, and I will sunder it from you."
There was no smirking contempt or lashing challenge from the child, only nodding assuredness.
"You may find, priest, that there are more things than heaven and hell in the wide world, though it may be too late once you learn them."
The crowd began to circle him as he prayed, but the priest had known they would. He was prepared to die for his endeavors, knowing full well that it would be better than the alternative. He had run from them before, run from his church as the devil came to him, and that had been his reason for leaving. As he hid in the forests that surrounded the town, praying for deliverance and hearing his parishioners scream in agony, he had felt the disapproval of his God, These Protestants may speak of God's love and forgiveness, but many of them had forgotten about God's wrath. God was still that vengeful entity that had burned Sodom and Gomorrah, that had told Abraham to sacrifice his child, who would burn Job's home and lands to the ground just to prove a point. And as Marley knelt in the woods, he felt certain that God would have loved nothing more than to strike him dead right there. Fortunately for him, God had plans for him, and now it was time for Marley to make good on those plans. If those plans were for him to die in martyrdom, it would still be better than watching another flock perish beneath the green man's brutality. He closed his eyes, reciting the Lord's Prayer, leading into the passages that would glorify God and humble the demons who resided here. He could feel the press of heat as they moved around him, and lifted his voice as he worked into a fervor. He would cleanse these people with his dying breath if he must, and when the gunshot erupted, Marley waited for the burn. The burn never came, but the press shifted a little as some of the crowd turned to regard the shooter. "That's enough," said a familiar voice, and Marley opened his eyes to see Officer Parks approaching with his gun leading the way. Officer Gibbs was close behind him, barrel wavering as he seemed unsure where to point it. "I don't know what the hell you're doing out here, and I don't really care. We're leaving with Pastor Marley. Anyone who gets in my way is going to jail for obstruction. That's a promise. Now disperse." The mob was in his way, two of them officers from the night shift. Marley was disappointed to see, and they showed no signs of compliance. Marley turned his head back to the pumpkin kid, directing his words to the embodiment of the interloper. The child seemed unaffected by those words, staring at him through hollow eyes, and Marley lifted his voice as another gunshot rang out. Whatever was going on behind him was irrelevant. The real battle was between he and the pumpkin head. Another shot went off. Something sprayed across the back of Marley's neck, and there was a wet sound like stone hitting meat. Someone had gone down, and Marley pulled the holy water from his pocket as he prayed one of his protectors hadn't been hurt. The water arced from the mouth of the bottle, dappling across the orange face of the pumpkin, and Marley finished his convictions as he waited for the coming hiss. He expected pain, convulsions, the wail of a spirit touched by God's judgment. But as the boy tilted his head as if to ask if that was all, Father Marley realized that he may have erred. "As I told you, priest, there's none of your devil here. Your God has no power over me or the master I serve. We are beyond you. We are strange, and your lamb God has no power within strange." Something flared to life behind the boy, and Marley realized, possibly too late, that his attention may have been on the wrong idol. The stone edifice behind him had begun to pulsate with a sickening red light. The small square in the center, the heart of the construct, was blinking like a caution light, and the longer Marley watched, the more he believed that something was rising from that light. It came galloping from the depths, growing larger with each passing moment, and when Marley was bumped unceremoniously to the side, he saw that he was not the only one who had taken notice. The crowd was coming back, their faces rapturous, as they watched whatever this was come into the world. "It is time," the pumpkin child said, raising his hands skyward as he invited them to witness. "The coming of the Winter Lord is upon us. The Green Man comes. He comes! He comes! He comes!" they chanted. As the rider burst from the stone square, growing as he landed on this side of the void, Father Marley was filled with a terrible knowledge. The child had been right. This creature was older than anything he knew, stranger than anything beneath the sun or moon, and as he tried to flee, his escape was halted. He briefly caught a glimpse of one of the officers crumpled on the ground, but the other was nowhere to be found. He briefly caught a glimpse of the road that would have taken him back to his car, if he could but find it. He would never see his car, his church, or anything comforting again. And as they spun him around, he came face to face with the green apparition that he had been right to run from so many years ago. He was mounted on a black horse, sleek and skeletal, and when he turned his armored head towards the priest, he was struck dumb by the power exuded from him. "I have come," said the green man, his voice like an avalanche from the coldest peak, "and the doom of worlds comes with me." Travis ran through the forest. He didn't know where he was going, but anything was better than what he was leaving behind. The front of his shirt was turning red, the wound on his stomach making him wince. But if he had any hope of keeping the rest of his blood where it belonged, he had to get away from here. He hadn't really thought they would attack them. They were their neighbors, their friends, and he had hoped that being found in such a compromising situation would shame some of them into leaving. When he and Gibbs had broken cover, Travis fired a single shot in the air to give the preacher time to run. He had hoped some of them would cut and run as well. Instead, they had been forced to shoot a few of them before whatever that thing had been came out of the weird stone box. They had killed Gibbs, at least Travis thought they had, and when one of them had slid a knife into his guts, Travis thought it would be the end of him too. Gibbs had shot Travis, the man reaching for his piece, but somehow the mob had gotten in behind them. Travis had heard his partner gurgle as someone slid a knife into the side of his neck, but he had barely brought the gun up to bear when a sharp pain had erupted in his stomach. He found Gabriel Tanner, someone he'd gone to high school with, grinning like a lunatic as he pulled the knife free, and when the man lifted it to deal him a killing blow, Travis thought that'd be the end of him. That's when they all turned, the pumpkin kid yelling about something, and he had been left on the ground to bleed. He'd gotten to his feet and run then, adrenaline still pumping, but as it began to ebb and the wood stretched out before him, he felt sure that he wouldn't make it out alive. When a root caught his foot and he went down in a sprawl on the forest floor, he thought this would be where he'd die. He was just starting to black out when a crunch of leaves brought him back to reality. Great, he thought. What fresh hell was this? "There he is! I told you I saw him run in this direction." Travis turned his head and thought he was seeing double for a minute. There were two pumpkin heads now, one big and one small, and they were both standing over him, looking down with their questioning triangle eyes. The difference between them and the one he'd seen in the pavilion, however, were that these two clearly had heads beneath. As he passed out, Travis wondered what he had been discovered by, and whether he would wake up on this side of the veil or the other. Sheriff Carl Hashwin lived alone about a mile from the station. He had never really found a woman to compete with his work, and after a series of quickly ended relationships, he eventually decided that being alone wasn't so bad. He had a daughter with one of them, a daughter he saw on holidays and sometimes during the summer, but other than that, he lived simply. So when his phone rang just after sunset, he was just finishing up his dinner and thinking about bed. Tomorrow was Halloween, and it was going to be a very long day. "Sheriff Hashwin," he said, not bothering to look at the number. It could only be a few different people, and all of them would be from the department. "Sheriff?" Molly said, and he could hear the fear in her voice. "Something's going on. I can't get in touch with Dreyfus or Gage. I tried to call Parks and Gibbs to see if they had any other way to get up with them, but I can't seem to get them either. I don't really know what to do here, and neither of them have checked in for about 2 hours." Carl was already getting his uniform on. He had left it laid across the chair in the bedroom. Not much sense in wearing a new one when he didn't do anything but sit in his office and field questions these days. Carl missed writing a route sometimes, missed feeling useful. He knew that he could get more done as the sheriff, but often it felt like the politics of the job held him back from doing anything meaningful. He slid his gun into his holster and grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door. "I'll be right there, Molly," he said. It was going to be a long night, too, it would appear. Daryl's Stutter was leaning against the door of his barn, Garvey Munchell leaning on the other side of the barn door as he smoked one of those shitty home-rolled cigarettes he liked. Stutter had the biggest barn amongst the four of them, and it had been decided that the remainder of the pumpkins would go into it until the trucks came tomorrow. The order for the processing plant would be a group effort this year, and it wouldn't leave them a lot of profit margins. "Garvey," Daryl finally said, his eyes starting to try to droop along with the sun, "roll me one of those darts, could you?" Garvey smirked around the coal. "Thought you gave 'em up last year." "I did, but if I have to sit here dozing and smelling you inhaling 'em, then I'm gonna need something to chase it off with." The farmer's wind-burnt face crinkled a little as he stepped over to his production rival and handed him one of the cigarettes. They were flimsy-looking things, made of cheap rolling papers, but the tobacco inside was rich and smooth. He suspected that Garvey had grown it himself, and suddenly he wondered if he sold it too. Daryl might pick it back up if he could drag a lungful of this in every evening. "Much obliged," he said, as Garvey put his lighter away. "Welcome. You think they'll come tonight?" Garvey asked, turning back to look at the field. Daryl shrugged. "I guess it'll have to be tonight if they do. This has progressed well past Halloween pranks, and I'm worried that it's personal this year." Garvey said nothing, but it was pretty clear that he'd come to the same conclusion. Garvey and Feynman had been just as hard hit as Stutter, but Stutter had more to lose, the way he saw it at least. He had twice as much land as they did, and his output was always higher because of it. The sheriff had promised to send aid, to protect their interests, but no help had come. Stutter had taken something else from the conversation, too. There had been a time when the farms had taken care of each other, had banded together instead of turning to the law, and that time had come again. If they could hold out till tomorrow, till the last produce truck came rolling in, they could all start again next year and hope for less helling than the year before. They had 40-odd hands out there, Feynman standing by with his rifle on top of the barn, and they would hold out against whatever might come. If it was kids, then they were going to give them a scare. If it were adults, maybe those bastards that had approached him a few years ago to buy him out for whatever growing co-op they were cooking up this time, well, it might just come to bloodshed then. Either way, tonight would be the end of this nonsense, so they could get back to work. As the sun set, stretching its black fingers across the land, Stutter loosed another yawn. It was going to be a long night. He wondered again why Camlin hadn't decided to stand with them. He had a pretty big plot too, though it was smaller than Daryl's or Garvey's, and he must have suffered losses. He had come to see him and found him out in the field tilling and planting for some reason. It was nearing November. There'd be no time for harvest again. He'd told him as much, but Camlin had ignored him. Daryl had looked around while he was there, seeming to feel an absence, but he couldn't place it. Camlin was too in his own delusions at this point to help them, and Daryl supposed it was better than wallowing in his wife's death. "You smell something?" Garvey asked, and Stutter shook himself awake as he realized that 2 hours had passed between blinks. "Just the smoldering pile of butts you've left around your boots." "Nah, something else," Garvey said, and that was when Stutter noticed the slight spark in the distance. He stood up straighter, seeing the beginnings of the blaze as it took hold. It was miles away, maybe the next farm over, and it looked like someone had set fire to Garvey's cornfield. The dry fuel was going up in great swatches, and a fire lit the night as Garvey began to tremble. "Too far. This is too far. I'm all for a little Halloween helling, but this is too much. I'll kill him. I'll kill the little bastard's dead," he shouted, making a wobbly run for his land before Stutter grabbed him. Garvey looked back at him like he wanted to slap him, but he must have seen something in the older farmer's eyes. Stutter wanted to let him go with him in fact, but he knew that that was what they wanted. That was a honeypot, and Stutter didn't mean to see anyone get stuck in it.
It's a trap, Garvey. Don't fall for it. It's just dry stalks. All the corn's in here. Little Tara's did you a favor, in fact. Now it'll be easier to plow it flat.
Garvey tried to tug away, but Darrell held him fast.
Don't be a fool. What matters is here. Here's where we make our stand.
Some of the hands had noticed it too, and they were coming to stand around the front of the barn as they gawked at the burning field of corn husks.
Get ready, boys. The rabble's coming to take what's ours, and I don't mean to stand by and let 'em have it.
Sheriff Carl walked into the station to find Molly with a phone on each ear and the switchboard on her desk lit up. She looked up hopefully, glad to have some backup, and she told the caller to hold as she put the phones down. She looked frazzled, like she'd been pulling at her short blonde hair, and her mascara looked runny like she might have been crying.
Thank God! I didn't know what to do, Sheriff. The calls have been coming in for hours. Where have you been? I called you before sunset.
Sheriff Carl took a seat beside her, looking over some of the notes that she had taken.
Sorry, darling. I was hoping to find my missing deputies at Fuller's with their radios off, or maybe broken down somewhere. I drove around for a bit looking for 'em, but so far I've found nothing, not hide nor hair of 'em.
Molly nodded, but she still looked miffed.
Well, I could have really used you here. The calls from the farmland have been coming in since sunset. I've got reports of a fire at the Munchell place, weird sightings of people on the road, and several houses calling about prowlers.
Have you heard back from any of the callers with the prowlers?
Nope. And I've tried calling more than a few of them back. I don't know what's going on, and I'm stuck here with no one to report back.
As the phone began to ring again, Molly picked it up in a huff and asked the caller how she could help them.
Yes, ma'am. I'm aware of the fire at the Munchell Ranch. Yes, ma'am. I know. There's something going on at the Stutter farm, too.
Molly was quiet for a few seconds as she listened.
A fight? Do you know who's involved? Men in masks. Yes, ma'am. I'll have a unit out there as soon as I'm able.
She hung up and looked at Carl, shrugging as she silently asked him what to do.
Call Sully and Mikowski. Get them down here right away. Tell them it's an emergency and we need them here ASAP. I'll go down to the Stutter farm and see what's going on.
He dug his keys out as he walked over to the weapons cage where they kept the shotguns.
And what happens when something happens to you and I'm stuck here by myself?
Molly asked, a little angrier than she meant to.
Carl loaded one of the shotguns and, after considering it for a minute, brought it to the desk with a box of shells.
You know how to use one of these, I trust.
Molly scoffed. Of course, Sheriff.
If things go sideways, use it to defend yourself. If I don't check in after an hour, lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but Sully or Clarence. He took another shotgun down and loaded it, stuffing a handful of shells into his pocket before turning to go.
I'll call you when I know something, he said, leaving before she could raise too much of a fuss. He could sense something building, a pressure more dire than any storm, and he hoped that he could stop it before it covered the whole town in a downpour of trouble. They were coming from the fields that surrounded the barn, their bodies cutting small runners against the corn or the wheat. Stutter wasn't sure who they were or what they meant to do, but as he clutched at the stock of his shotgun, he knew that he hadn't brought enough bullets to handle them. Garvey had a pitchfork from the barn, his pistol shoved into the front of his jeans like a bandit's blunderbuss. Most of the farm hands had implements from the barn as well, pitchforks and rakes and various other things. A few of them were armed with handguns as well, though. They were ready, or so they thought, to scare a bunch of kids back to town, but they couldn't have guessed what they would find coming out of the fields when the stalks parted. The hellions were wearing masks, weird sackcloth things that reminded Stutter of scarecrows, and he saw a few of the farmhands step back in confusion. They were armed with knives, most of them likely having come from someone's kitchen block, and they came into the space between the field and the barn with herky-jerky movements, like marionettes. They were unsettling to look at, and Stutter could already tell that most of them were not children. Far from it. The majority of them looked like high school may have been a few years beyond them, and that only solidified Stutter's ideas that this was an attempt to take his land. When Stutter fired his gun into the air,
He had hoped to get a reaction out of them, but they never even flinched. "You're trespassing on my land. You have till a count of 10 to turn around and take your asses back the way you came. 1, he started, as he cocked his shotgun and slid a fresh shell into the tube. 2, 3, but as he raised the gun, he realized he would never make it to 4. They were charging in, 10, 20, 30 of them, and they were howling for blood. He fired once, dropping a hooded figure, but the second shot went high as someone slapped the gun away and pushed a knife into his guts. Stutter felt surprise fill him, even as the blood filled the wound in his stomach. They had never intended to scare him. This was murder, a coup, and he fell into the mud as he saw others being cut down as well. They were quick, these scarecrows, and as the farmhands broke and ran, he saw Garvey swing his pitchfork at a couple of them who danced out of the way. He pulled his gun out, attempting to shoot down a third as it charged at him, but his shot went wide as something stabbed him in the back. He went down, a dozen of them falling on him as they cut him to ribbons, and Darrell got a good look at his terrified face as a sudden brightness burst to life. He rolled painfully onto his back as the barn burst into flames with a whoosh of ignited fuel. The plan had never been theft, he realized too late. The plan had always been destruction, and as he lay there bleeding, with the bright new fire scorching fiery lights into his corneas, he saw a shadow fall across him. The horse's hooves made muddy thumps on the ground, and Darrell rolled over to see a rider as he towered over him. The man looked like a knight, but not the sort from King Arthur stories. This one looked like a haunted suit of armor, and before him on the saddle rode a kid with a pumpkin head. Darrell didn't know what was happening, and what happened next was as close to a mercy as he would receive from this one. Darrell's vision was getting soupy, and when the horse's hoof came down on his head, it was almost a blessing. Darrell died on the land he had tilled since he was a boy, but his water would nourish no crops that night. Travis groaned as he tried to sit up, his hands falling to his ribs as he looked around. He was lying on a cot in someone's basement. His uniform was laying across a chair in the corner, and someone had tried their best to get the bloodstains out of it. Whatever had patched him up had done a great job. They had cleaned and stitched the wound across his stomach, but Travis's question was why. The last thing he remembered seeing was someone with a pumpkin head. A couple of pumpkin heads, in fact, and if that was the case, then they had to be in league with the one on the dais. Didn't they? A light at the head of the stairs drew his attention, and as the stairs creaked, Travis braced himself for what was to come. It was the moment of truth now. Which would it be? The lady or the tiger? It was neither, as it turned out. Just a man with a tray of food and a fresh pumpkin on his head.
"Oh, good. You're awake,"
he said, his voice a little echoey through the pumpkin's carved mouth.
"Margaret was pretty sure you'd be fine. Are you hungry? My wife makes a mean grilled cheese."
He set the tray down across Travis's lap, and sure enough, there was a grilled cheese sandwich, a bowl of soup, and a can of ginger ale. Travis watched the guy distrustfully as he sat down at the foot of the bed, but the smell of soup was a little too much to resist. He had eaten half the sandwich, dipping it into the steaming soup, before he dared to ask his questions. "Did you and your son save me in the woods?"
"Daughter, actually, but yes, we did. We've been keeping an eye on the growing flock that's been springing up, and when we saw you escape, we knew that we had to help you."
"Why is that?" Travis husked, his voice cracking a little as he grabbed for the pop.
"Why? Well, golly, why not? You'd be dead if we hadn't."
"Yeah, but why help them at all? Isn't that gonna get you in trouble with your flock?" The pumpkin head shook in negation.
"It would be, if we were part of it, but we aren't."
"Could have fooled me," Travis said, as the ginger ale cooled his throat a little.
"Well, looks can be deceiving. The pumpkin boy's been tricked into doing what he's doing, tricked by the one that forces us to wear these pumpkin heads.
Who? Travis asked, but before the fella could answer, Travis thought he understood. You mean the Green Man?
The Green Man, yes,
the man said, a guy that Travis was already beginning to think of as Pa Pumpkin. Why would he force you to wear pumpkin heads if you aren't part of his cult?
Oh, the pumpkins aren't of him. The Green Man hates pumpkins, in fact, but he also fears them.
I don't understand, Travis said, his head feeling a little woozy, though the soup was helping a bit. Pa Pumpkin turned his carved head back towards Travis.
It's a long story. The short version is that we wear them to keep us safe. Otherwise, he'd find us and extract the debt that he swore to take.
Debt? Travis said, all of this making very little sense. His head felt heavy and he was getting a little dizzy, probably the blood loss he assumed. He lay back, the soup only about half gone, and watched the shimmer on the ceiling as he tried to make his head stop spinning.
Yes, he considers our lives his to take. He's a greedy old thing. He's followed us to more than one town, but we always manage to hide from him.
So, is he here for you, or... Travis couldn't make it make sense, though.
Who knows? This is just what he does. He can't come into our world without sacrifice. At least, that's what we were told. He needs to be invited, but there's always someone to manipulate to get him here. Usually it's children, I think. He gives them what they want the most, and in return, they help him come into the world.
Travis tried to sit up, tried to get his bearings about him, but it was hopeless. He just couldn't make the room stop spinning. He teetered, in danger of falling out of bed, and when Pa Pumpkin reached out to stop him from falling, Travis was very grateful.
Whoa, easy there, champ. You aren't quite ready to rejoin society yet. Get some rest. I'll pop back in a little later and see how you're feeling.
Travis tried to protest, but as he lay back and attempted to muster his strength, he felt himself slipping back into a nearly comatose state. Yes, ma'am, I heard you the first time. The sheriff is aware of the fire and doing everything he can to ensure public safety. Yes, ma'am, injured people at the Stutter Farm. I've contacted EMS to send them to the scene. I heard you. Yes, sir. I know there are people on the road. I have officers going to check into it right now. The phone kept ringing, but Molly finally threw it down and growled loudly. It had been a really shitty night so far, and she was kind of over it. Anything we can do to help, Molly? Sully asked for about the 1,000th time. He and Clarence had arrived about an hour ago, and were completely perplexed by what was going on. Sully was in full uniform, never one to go looking slouchy to a job, but Clarence had thrown on jeans and an old sheriff's department undershirt before coming in. He had gotten here before Sully, but he definitely didn't inspire much confidence. Both were here, however, and that made her feel a little better. Nothing comes to mind, Sully. You guys just sit there till the sheriff. But as if summoned by the thought of him, the door burst open, and in walked Sheriff Carl. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Sully, Clarence, get those guns out of the cabinet and come with me. Molly, either hide or come with us, but either way, take that shotgun with you. I need you to call up the volunteer firefighters and the EMS crew ASAP and send them to way ahead of you, Sheriff, but it's no good. No one answers at either center, and I still can't raise anyone from the other offices. I'm afraid that this is all the help we're going to get. Sheriff Carl didn't seem to like that, but he pushed it aside. Very well. 4 is better than none. Come on, boys. It's time to earn those checks. What's going on, Sheriff? Sully asked, feeding rounds into his weapon as he tucked the rest into his pocket. There's a mob of hellions on the way into town, the same mob that set fire to the Stutter Farm. We need to suppress them before they can wreck up the town, which seems to be their intent if the houses on the way are any indication. The 2 officers stopped mid-load, looking at Carl with real unease. How many of them are we talking? Clarence asked. No idea. Does it matter? We're the law in this town, and it's our job to keep the peace. Doesn't matter if it's 10 or 10,000. We don't let hellions take the town. They both looked ready to refuse, But when Molly took up her gun and joined the sheriff by the door, that seemed to settle them. They weren't going to sit here and hide while the sheriff and a switchboard operator protected the whole damn town. The four of them set out, the streets eerily quiet before the storm, intent on holding them back, or dying in the process. Sheriff Carl left the office, his 3 deputies in tow. He was heading towards Main Street, and felt certain that the crowd would be going in that direction. If he meant to intercept them, then he needed to get them before they got to the residential areas. He felt his hands clutching at the stock of the familiar shotgun as he tried to calm himself down after what he had seen out in the country. He had driven to the old Stutter place so he could check and see if his officers were there. It wasn't like Gage and Dreyfus to just not answer their radio, and he was afraid that they were hurt. What he had seen from behind the wheel of his cruiser was a large group of scarecrows as they set fire to the barn and killed the hands that had come to protect it. They weren't interested in theft. They didn't want any of the produce that he had laid in the barn. They just wanted to destroy what he had made. It was senseless, it was needless, and it seemed to be exactly what they were after. He had gotten as close as he dared, and a few of them had looked up and seen him with their sightless sackcloth eyes. He had found his courage lacking then, driving back to town in a hurry as more of them came lumbering from the field. It shamed him to think about it, but what else could he have done? He had no hope against the small army, and he hoped that he would find what he believed was waiting for him on Main Street. The town of Fraziers was an old one, and sometimes the people could feel things on the wind and know where they were needed. To everyone's surprise but his, there was a small group waiting for them on Main Street. Mr. Worley, from the general store, was sitting with a rifle balanced on his shoulder. Mrs. Binks, the postmistress, had a small handgun clutched in her trembling fist. The Alamo brothers from the Quickfill were there, Darrell Landry and 6 of the volunteer firefighters with their axes sitting on the pavement. John Moreau, the local garbage collector with a crowbar, Mr. LeBeau from the high school, and about 6 others that Carl couldn't identify right offhand. They were all standing around something that was slumped by the crossroads of Main Street and Chambers, and as Sheriff Carl came up even with them, he realized it was Pastor Marley. The old-timer had been through the ringer. He looked like he had run head first through about 7 miles of bad country, and his face and hands were all cut up. He was dressed as a priest for some reason, though no one in town had ever known him as anything but a Baptist minister. If he had brought any of the implements of the priesthood with him, they were now long gone. His robe was in tatters, and he had lost both his shoes, but his collar was still in place and pristine-looking. Carl got knee-bound beside the preacher, trying to get some kind of statement before he passed out from his injuries. "What happened, Pastor? Who did this to you?" Pastor Marley stuttered a little, but Carl was certain that he was saying something. "I need you to tell me who did this. Was it the Scarecrow men? Was it something else? Who?" "Green man," the pastor husked out weakly. "Green man?" Carl asked, not sure what he was talking about. "He's here. He's come. Now we all die," Marley said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Sheriff Carl growled, hoping that he did. He looked at the ragtag little group that had assembled and wondered if even they had a say in the fate of the town. If there's anyone who's not here that'll stand with us, now would be the time to call them. We might be the last line of defense for Fraziers. A few of them left to make calls, but Carl doubted that anyone else was likely to show up. He had been hoping to find Gibbs and Parks here, but no such luck. He had a sneaking suspicion that they were both involved in this already. It wasn't like Parks not to pick up his phone, and Gibbs was the type that would have already sensed something was going on. They were good kids, and he hoped that wherever they were safe. Carl looked at a few of the younger firefighters then, pointing to the preacher as he lay splayed out across the pavement. "Get him somewhere safe. You can put him in the police station, I suppose. There's a little room in the back where we keep people under protection. Just put him on one of the cots in there." They nodded, getting underneath him so they could take him away. The old priest sagged in their hands, and as the Main Street fountain chugged away placidly, Carl decided this is where they would make their stand. Why not, he thought. It was as good a place to die as any. He assembled them into some sort of defensive line, telling those without guns to hang back so they could defend the ones that had them. Those with firearms would try to hold them back as long as they could, and then it would be up to those with axes and crowbars and the like to keep them safe. He pricked up his ears as he began to hear something over the splashing of the fountain. "What's that?" Sullivan asked, glancing around as he tried to find the source of the noise. It was faint, like a horse's hooves, and as it got louder, Carl was afraid of what he might find. "Get some cover," he said to his assembled militia, and as they got low and made ready, the hooves made a slow but rhythmic beat on the concrete. Clop, 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 clop. He could see a horse coming, the rider practically bristling with armor. Clop, 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 clop. Behind the rider was a shadow of others, a roiling fog of individuals who seemed to bring the haze with them. They were ragged, a filthy army of castaways that trailed behind the horsemen like a cloak. Carl felt certain that they were the scarecrows he had seen before, and their numbers had increased since the last time he'd laid eyes on them. Clop, 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 clop. Riding before the armored figure was a pumpkin child, his head bopping along with the armored knight's chest as he rode. This had to be the kid Parks had been talking about, the rebel-rouser who was responsible for all the trouble in town. He didn't seem put off by the armored giant in the least, and as they came riding up, Carl became sure that they didn't have nearly enough people. This army of scarecrows would ride right over the top of them, would brush them aside like leaves in a strong gust, and when Carl raised the shotgun to his shoulder, he never expected to see his crappy trailer or his cluttered office at the sheriff's department again. Clop, clop, clop. The horse came to a stop 30 steps from the assembled militia, and the armored figure seemed to cock his head as if just noticing them. "You are in my way," thundered the voice from beneath the helmet. "Move, or you will be scattered." Carl had to make a conscious effort not to comply. The rider held the voice of a winter storm, the voice of a blizzard as it threatened to knock your house down, the roof when it caves in under the weight of all that snow. How could he hope to stand against this creature? There was no standing against the coming of winter, and Carl had to remind himself that this was just some guy in a suit of armor, not an actual force of nature. This was his town, and he wasn't going to get run off by a bunch of roustabouts. "As sheriff of Frazier, I demand that your group disperse. Frazier isn't here for you to roll over, and I won't let you destroy my town." The little pumpkin kid leaned forward, and Carl was worried that he would tip over and fall off the horse. "No one can stand against the Winter Lord, Sheriff. If you lay down your arms, we may let you join us, but you cannot win against the might of winter." "We'll just see about that," Carl said, standing his ground as he faced the towering rider. There was a pregnant silence as the two made ready, and when the arm of the rider came up, Carl shuddered involuntarily. His hand sliced out towards the fountain, and the ragged mob behind him surged forward like a wave. The sounds of shotguns burst around him as Carl tried to find his mark, but they were nearly upon him before he fired. Father Marley was huddling in the woods, smelling the fires that burned his parish to the ground again. The sounds of destruction rode the wind like errant sparks, and the screams of the dying were like a brand on his mind. They were killing them while he hid, killing them all while he hunkered in the bushes, and as he prayed, Marley felt a new brand mark him. It had to be the same feeling Cain had withstood when God sent his pain upon him, and Marley was afraid that he too must be cast out of all that he had known and loved. He would walk in exile if that was what God said he must do. He would go willingly into the land of Nod if he must. He was a coward, an unfit shepherd, and he had allowed his flock to suffer for his inadequacies. When the hooves sounded near him, he started. The whinny of that ghostly horse sent his eyes skyward, and suddenly the green man was overtop him. As that great bloody axe came down to end his exile early, Marley came staggering from sleep to find himself in a little room with no windows. He looked around, wild-eyed and confused, until someone told him to shut the hell up. On a cot in the corner sat someone that he knew. Sitting with his knees against his chest and his eyes staring sullenly was Nathan Casterly. "It's bad enough being stuck in this little room without you freaking out," he said, as Marley fixed on him. "Where are we?" Marley asked, rubbing his eyes and wincing as his cuts burned. "The police station. They brought you in a couple of hours ago. You look pretty rough. What happened to you?" Marley didn't think he was curious for purely humanitarian reasons. Casterly, besides being a staunch atheist, was a writer for the Comet, the local paper that seemed to have more gossip than news these days. Nathan seemed to be an all-around contrarian from what Marley had read, and when he had questioned why the city had put a new roof on the old church last spring after the nasty blizzard, Marley had come under his scrutiny for the first time. The reporter had dug up his lapsed Catholic ties and his exile from the church, self-imposed or not, and made some pretty nasty parallels between his old religion and his closeness with youth sports and outreach in the community. He was a vicious little prick, but Marley found that he had little else for company. "I was out in the woods, trying to stop the coming of the green man." He could still see it, the rider bursting from the altar, the sounds of hooves on the pavilion, the deep voice of the green man as he came forth. He hadn't seen him when he came to destroy his town the first time, but now he lived as big as life in his head forever. "You saw the kids in the woods?" Casterly said, lifting his face off his knees. "What happened? Are they forming a cult out there? Who's this green man they keep talking about?" Marley thought about where to begin and decided on the last one. "No one really knows. He's some kind of pagan spirit of winter. People worship him, but I don't think they really understand him. He gathers people to him with promises, but I think it's a monkey's paw situation. The things he gives them have strings attached, and those strings become chains before they really know what's happening." The chains had become pretty real in the woods. The people had gathered around the green man, and he had bestowed upon them his blessing. He had turned them into scarecrows, changed their flesh to sack and straw, and taken their will from them. They had screamed and writhed as he reveled in their subservience, and the pumpkin child had done little but watch as the mob twisted. They were silent then. Cloth and straw had no voice. But Marley was gone by that point. He had run as fast as he could, and that was how he had come to be in town so the militia could find him. Casterly nodded. "I guess it wouldn't be that hard to form some kind of cult around here, especially not from an old winter deity. But what do they want? What's their goal in a little town like Frazier?" "Same thing winter always wants. It destroys the weak and leaves the strong behind. The green man is judging Frazier to see if it's worthy." Casterly thought about it for a second or two. But why? What does this green guy get out of this? Who knows? He's not from here. His motives and goals are known only to himself. Marley smacked his lips, his mouth feeling dry and his tongue possessing something mealy and unpleasant. There's water in the little fridge over there, Casterly said hastily. Some snacks, too, though it's nothing much. They say this is a safe room, but it mostly just feels like an interrogation room with cots. Should have known better than to think those two would actually keep me safe. Parks has always been a shitheel. Officer Parks? Is he here too? Marley asked. Haven't seen him. He and his partner dropped me off before they went to go check out the meeting in the woods. Guessing they may not have come back. Otherwise, they're probably part of Sheriff Hashwin's posse. Marley remembered something, a passing image of Officer Parks yelling at the crowd, but it was gone before he could properly mull it over. He remembered gunshots, the spray of something on his neck, but he couldn't remember what had happened to the officers. He hoped they were okay, but they had bigger problems now, especially if the Green Man was in Frazier. Is there any way out of here? Marley asked, looking at the door but guessing that it might be locked. Nope, door only opens from the outside, so hopefully someone lives that remembers we're in here. Is there a phone? I need to let them know something that might help them against the Green Man. Marley perked up. Yeah? What's that? It's the jack-o'-lanterns. The Green Man and his allies always start by destroying the jack-o'-lanterns. If the sheriff wants to win against him, he needs one of those jack-o'-lanterns. Travis winced as he slid his arm into the uniform shirt. The stain on the shirt had ruined the tan fabric, but it was all he had to mark him as a member of the department. He had woken up in the wee hours of the morning and decided that it might be the best time to make a break for it. The house was asleep, and if he was quick, he could still get back to town and warn them before it was too late. His guts hurt something fierce, but he thought the stitches might be okay if he was careful. He came up the stairs as quickly as he could, the creaks making him wince when he came down too hard, and as he reached the doorknob, he was surprised to find it unlocked. He hadn't heard any noise from the top floor, and when he came upstairs, he found Pa Pumpkin sitting at the table and jumped a little in surprise. That was how he had come to think of them. Pa Pumpkin was the one in the bibballs and flannel. Lil Pumpkin was the kid that he'd seen in the woods, and as he stood peeking through the basement door, he got his first look at Ma Pumpkin's. She wore a long skirt in a fall pattern, and her pumpkin was a lighter shade of orange than the others. She had her back to him, bustling around the kitchen as she prepared breakfast for the family, and as he looked back, he realized that Pa Pumpkin had spotted him. Don't be shy. Come have a seat. Let's talk before you head out. Travis thought about refusing him for half a second, but as the smell of pancakes and eggs and fresh coffee wafted under his nose, he decided that it might be a good idea to meet his end with a full stomach. Marley hadn't been the only one to see that weird horseman who'd come bounding up from nowhere, and Travis held no illusions that he could stand up against something like that. He was one of those boogans that his mother had always claimed would get him if he wasn't good, and you couldn't kill boogans with bullets. He had barely sat down, groaning as his wound ached, when a plate came down in front of him, and he looked up to see the carved smile of Ma Pumpkin's. Eat as much as you like. You're our guest, and we have so few. It was hard to tell, but Travis thought Pa might have given her a disapproving look as she retreated. Travis tried to control himself, but it was hard with all that food in front of him. He had done for the cakes before he knew it, and the eggs were going down pretty quickly, too. His stomach was accepting the grub, and he guessed that the knife had probably missed anything having to do with digestion. Likely it had just been one of those painful gut wounds that kills you slowly and hurts like hell while it does it. Pa Pumpkin let him finish his grub before starting, and Travis saw him lifting his pumpkin just a bit as he ate some of his own breakfast. "You can take that off if you want," Travis said. "You don't have to wear it on my account."
"That's very kind, but we never take our pumpkins off, not even to sleep. We only take them off for the briefest of moments when they start to rot, and then it's to replace them with a new one."
Travis was speechless. "So you never take them off? Why is that?"
"The easiest answer is that we're wearing them to hide."
"Hide? From who?" Travis asked.
"I think you know,"
Pa Pumpkin said. "You mean from the Green Man?" He nodded. "You've seen him before?" Pa nodded again. "How did you escape?" Travis asked, barely noticing the plate of bacon and eggs that Ma sat by his elbow.
"We hid. Our daughter was young, barely a year, and we ran before they could burn our house with us inside it. They got our land, they got our crops and our home, but they didn't get us because we had found what they fear."
"And what's that?" Travis asked, leaning forward as if to accept a great secret. Pa tapped the side of his pumpkin.
"Why, jack-o'-lanterns, of course."
Travis was confused. Then why did he give the kid one to wear? Pa lifted the gourd to take another sip of coffee, wetting his pipes before getting going.
"He decorates many of his greatest players with pumpkins. He thinks it's funny, some kind of blasphemy towards his rival, and many of his creatures are perversions of growing things. The scarecrows, the pumpkin men, there's some who say he has servants made of corn or autumn growing things, though I've never seen one. He likes to twist things that grow, but not the pumpkins. He hates pumpkins because he knows what they represent and what they will become. I realized that when his minions turned away from me as I threatened to toss one of them at them when they tried to burn my house, at least until one of his human servants crushed the ones I had on the porch. So we wear them. We grow them year-round in our greenhouse, and we stay out of his sight so he doesn't find us. At least, we had until very recently."
Travis nodded, though it didn't make a lot of sense. Why would this Green Man be afraid of jack-o'-lanterns? He was huge, armed and armored, and it seemed ludicrous that some flimsy plant would keep him away. Travis chewed at the bacon as he considered it, remembering how the kids had destroyed the decorations in the town first. They had wrecked the jack-o'-lanterns, smashed the pumpkins at Darryl Stutter's field, and all because they knew the power that they held. That was the piece that he had been missing. The wanton destruction had never made a lot of sense, but now it seemed downright targeted. All the more reason to get back to town before it's too late, Travis said, getting up to go. Pa Pumpkin put a hand over his, and Travis grew still.
"Hold on a minute, boy. We want to help you. We'd prefer if you stayed here until all this blows over. But since you clearly won't do that, then we want to help."
"Help?" Travis asked. "How can you help me?"
"By giving you some wisdom and some things you might need before it's all over."
Travis sat, glancing at the window to see that the horizon was still dark. Maybe he had a little time yet. "Fall back to the station," Carl yelled, swinging his shotgun stock at a charging scarecrow. The thing went flying, its body light as a feather as it smacked against the nearby storefront. That had surprised Carl when he blew the first one into a shower of straw, but by now he was numb to it. It felt like he'd been fighting for hours, and his arms were as sore from the strain as they were from the slashes that oozed hatefully on his skin. They had come on strong, their numbers pushing the defenders of Frazier away from the fountain, and Carl had been worried that they would lose the town in the first wave. The scarecrows seemed endless, and he had been worried that ending them would splatter someone's kid across the streets. Carl wanted to save Frazier, but he didn't want to wash the streets in blood to do it. That had caused him to hesitate, and almost cost him his life. He had been aiming for the green man, trying to get most of the buckshot on him from this distance, and when the scarecrow had popped up in front of him, he had squeezed the trigger in surprise. The knife it had held dug into his arm a second before he was feathered with straw and dust. There was nobody inside the sack. The costume was some sort of homunculus of rags and straw, and the second one erupted with less hesitation. The battle had gone on around him like a blur. Carl had never been to war, but he'd been involved in several exchanges of gunfire in his career. Those had seemed to go by at 5 times speed, but this one seemed to happen in a blurred series of memories. They were retreating from the plaza. Carl cut across the face while he reloaded. Mrs. Binks being stabbed to death by a ring of scarecrows. 2 of the firefighters fighting back to back when they were suddenly buried beneath a press of bodies. Clarence dead in the road suddenly, though Carl couldn't say how. It all happened as they were pushed back into Frazier, and before he knew it, Carl could see the sheriff's office looming up behind him. "Get inside," he yelled, knocking a few more down as Sully and Mr. Worley shoved through the doors. Carl was the last one in, and he was suddenly glad that he had put the wood up over the broken window before going home the day before. As he closed and locked the door, he looked out at that hateful demon as he sat on the horse, glowering at them. He didn't raise a hand against them. Not yet, and had simply walked forward as the scarecrows ate up ground. "Sheriff, one side," Sully said, as he and some of the others shoved desks and things in front of the door. The front doors and the windows were really the only entryway inside, besides the motor pool doors, and that was gauged steel. The old building was dated, but the architect had seen no reason to fill it with windows. They had opted for the little ones at the tops of the walls, and they were too small for most kids to slip through. As Carl thought about exits and entries, he also assessed the troops that he had left after the press. Sully, Molly, Mr. Worley, one of the Alamo brothers, Darrell Landry, and 3 of his volunteers from the fire station. Some of the others, some who had been there from the start, and some who joined in. Some of them Carl knew, some of them he didn't, but they were down to the nitty-gritty now. There were about 12 of them all told, 14 if you counted the 2 in the security room, and Carl supposed that he had to. "Sully, go to the armory and arm anyone who doesn't have a gun. Get ammo for the rest, and get ready to hold the line." Sully nodded. "Where are you going, Sheriff?" "To wake up some fresh recruits." Pastor Marley was sitting up, almost like he was waiting for the sheriff, and Nathan looked afraid as the door came open. "Sheriff, thank God, I need to—" "There'll be time for that, but right now I need you both out front." "Why?" Casterly asked distrustfully. "'Cause we're backed into a corner here, and if you 2 want to maintain the safety we promised, then you'll need to help." "I can do that," Marley said. They both looked at Casterly, who finally made a disgusted noise and got up to follow them. "Good. Get a gun and head to the bullpen. Sheriff, there's an easy way to win this. We need a jack-o'-lantern." Carl looked at the man like he might have lost his wits. "A jack-o'-lantern." "I know how it sounds, but they work like totems. The green man is afraid of them, and if we can find one, it'll scare him away from Frazier." Carl shook his head. "Well, I've heard and seen some strange things tonight. Who knows what we may need to do before the sun comes up." He came back to the front to see Molly looking intently out the peephole in the front. "We've got a problem, Sheriff," she said. "Don't we just?" he said a little more sarcastically than he intended to. "I couldn't tell you how, not with it pushing 70 out there, but there's a fog rolling in, and visibility is next to nil." The sheriff looked out and saw the pea soup fog bank rolling through the town like a biblical plague. Just what we needed.
So you see, all you need to do is light the pumpkin with this candle. Once he sees the gourd, the green man will flee, and all of this will be over.
Travis nodded. Pa Pumpkin had laid out how he could win, and now he had the tools to save his town. He glanced at the window and started when he saw light peeking on the horizon. It was nearly morning, and he was still here. Travis stood up, not realizing how early it had gotten. I gotta go. I may be too late already.
If you're sure that you still want to go.
Travis nodded, but it was a slow nod. I have to. I took a vow to protect and serve, and this is one of those times I have to live up to it. Besides, I've got to do this for my partner.
Then take this,
Pa said, Ma handing him a candle and a lighter and a sack which turned out to be a mask. It reminded him of a scarecrow's face, and it felt burlappy under his fingers.
It might help you get into town without being noticed. Just move a little stiffly. Though, that probably won't be too much of a problem for you.
Travis thanked them, stopping to grab a knife from the block as he went by. If your story is to be believed, though, it sounds like I'm going to need a pumpkin. Pa nodded.
Sadly, we don't have any to offer.
He pointed out the window, and Travis gasped when he saw that their greenhouse had been burned down. The barn had a little discoloration as well, but it was clear where the target had been. The pumpkins stood out like cow flops on the burnt earth, and Travis wondered how they would manage without a readily available stock of pumpkins.
Don't worry, we had each changed out our pumpkins recently, so we'll be fine until the greenhouse is rebuilt. But we don't have any to spare. You'll have to hope to find one on the way to town, I guess.
I can't take that chance, Travis said, sounding a little more put out than he meant to. Sorry, but yours could be the last pumpkin in 100 miles. I just need one. It's not like I need a truck full. Pa Pumpkin made a sound somewhere between embarrassment and exasperation.
I sure wish we could help you, but with the green man in town, we have to keep ourselves covered. We've only got what we're wearing, at least until the greenhouse is fixed.
Travis smacked the table in frustration. Why even tell me the secret of winning if you weren't going to give me a pumpkin? I swear it's like you dangled it in front of me and just snatched it away when it was time to jump.
We offered to let you stay here in safety. You're the one who wants to leave. For all you know, the town's already gone, and your vow means nothing.
For all you know, they're waiting on a jack-o'-lantern to snatch victory from defeat, Travis shot back. Pa shook his head.
If you're leaving, then go. We've told you our resources are limited, and if you can't accept that, then he can have mine.
A small voice came from behind Travis, and Pa turned his hollow eyes towards the entry to the kitchen. Travis looked to find the little pumpkin kid he'd seen in the park, peeking from behind the door.
Margaret, I thought you were sleeping.
Pa tried to sound good-natured, but came out as exasperated as Ma Pumpkin walked over to try to get her daughter back upstairs. Margaret, however, was intent on helping.
I want to help. The people in town don't deserve to die while we hide. I want to help.
She was reaching up for her head, but Travis shook his as he told her not to. Thanks, darling, but I don't want to put you in danger.
As long as you defeat the green man, then I won't be.
As the pumpkin came off, Travis saw her long hair fall from the hole. She handed the pumpkin to him, and he tried to ignore the way her hands shook as he reached for it. Ma Pumpkin took hold of it, though.
Maggie, no! You can't! Charles, tell her!
But Pa Pumpkin stood looking at his beheaded daughter, his carved eyes bored into her, as if trying to assess whether she knew what she was giving up.
Maggie, do you understand what you're doing?
Maggie nodded. I want to help, Daddy. It would be nice not to have to walk around with a pumpkin on my head for a change. Pa thought about this before nodding as well. Travis, be very careful with that pumpkin. It could be the last chance that Frazier has. Travis thanked her, thanked them all, before heading out. Pa had tossed him his car keys, but told him to leave it at the outskirts of Frazier. It would blow your cover to come into town driving a car. Good luck, young man. Travis put the little pumpkin in the passenger seat, buckling it in before setting off. Hopefully, he was carrying the salvation of Frazier in that passenger seat. Carl felt his eyes trying to slip shut. You would have said such a thing was impossible, but as the sun came up over Frazier, it did little to dissipate the fog that held them captive through the wee hours of the night. The scarecrows had stayed away from the door, but you could see them in the soup if you looked hard enough. They were hiding, but not very well. Of the armored man or the pumpkin child, there was no sight. The scarecrows seemed to be holding him hostage, and the sheriff was afraid that they were just trying to lure them into a false sense of security. As another yawn came, it seemed that they were just waiting for the adrenaline to run out, the long night of fighting to catch up with them. Once the participants were asleep, they could storm the doors and carry them off to whatever awaited them. I recommend we sleep in shifts, Carl said suddenly. Those in the station with him looked confused, so Carl said it again. With all due respect, Sheriff, who the hell can sleep at a time like this? As if in answer, Molly loosed a long yawn that cut through them like one of the scarecrow's knives. If you're fresh, Mr. Worley, then you can take the first shift. I suggest the pastor and Casterly take the first shift as well as anyone who feels like they can last more than a few hours. Casterly bristled a little, as Carl felt that he probably would. Just why should I take the first shift? I don't want to be here in the first place. You're here for protection, Carl said, and if you intend to continue being protected, you're going to have to do it yourself. You and the father have had a good night's sleep, something the rest of us haven't had access to. You three wake us up if anything looks like it's happening out there. The rest of us will get some shut-eye till it does. I'll stay up too, said Sullivan. I'm feeling pretty okay. Carl doubted it, but Sullivan was a grown man. If he wanted to abuse himself, then that was his business. Carl took a seat in his office and cradled his head in his hands as he tried to get some sleep. A few others came in to lay on the floor, Molly and the remaining Alamo brother amongst them, and soon the sounds of snoring helped Carl drift off into oblivion. He went back to the last place he wanted to go, the farmland. He had arrived just in time to see the barn go up. He had been out of the car in a matter of seconds, shotgun in hand, but when he'd seen the scarecrows coming out of the corn towards him, he had lost his nerve. Carl had been involved in a lot of different things in his time in law enforcement, but seeing that many hooded figures swinging from the depths of the stutter field had filled him with an unknown dread. He had climbed into his car and driven away as fast as he could, but in his dream there was no escape. In his dream, the car would not start. In his dream, they had climbed onto the hood of his cruiser and smacked the windshield with the point of their cool knives. In his dream, they had come through the windshield and filled the car with their terrible selves, stabbing him as he came sputtering out of the blackness of sleep. It was 2 hours later, and the office was full of snoring bodies that were likely having better dreams than him. Carl tried to put his head down and find a little more sleep, but it just wouldn't come. Instead, he got up and went to check on the people standing watch. The writer and the preacher were moving around, like they weren't quite sure what to do, and Mr. Worley was at the window with his old rifle, as if waiting for something to happen. He cast a disapproving look back at Sullivan, and Carl was not surprised to find him asleep. He wasn't mad. Who could blame him? They had all fought against the scarecrows for the better part of the night, and the fact that any of them were alive seemed to be a miracle. Sullivan came awake guiltily when the sheriff nudged him with his foot, gripping his gun and looking around as if he'd missed the ambush. "Anything to report?" "Nope. It's been strangely quiet, actually. I don't know if they're looking for weakness or just shoring up their numbers. I don't know how they make more of those scarecrows, but I have to wonder what happens to the people in town who aren't in the police station." Carl had entertained the same idea, but he couldn't help those people. The people who had chosen to stand with him during the initial push were the only ones he could help right now. He had to trust that some people had seen what was happening and were hunkered down. He had to hope they weren't the only armed resistance that was standing up against these things. Frazier was a farm town, and that usually meant that you had about twice as many guns as you did residents. There had to be someone out there organizing and trying to help people, just like Carl. He hoped against hope that Gibbs and Parks might be out there, helping. Even Gage and Dreyfus would be a help right now, but he couldn't waste a lot of thought on that at the moment. Right now it was about the present, and the present was bleak. "Go catch a few hours, Sullivan. I think I've had about as much sleep as I can handle right now." He looked like he wanted to argue, but in the end, he got up and took himself to the sheriff's office with the others. Carl took Sullivan's spot and laid his own gun across his lap. It was his turn to take a watch. Pastor Marley hadn't held a gun in a long time. The one he had held when he was in the Marines had been a carbine, but the shotgun was not unknown to him. It seemed strange for a man of faith to take up arms in this way, but this was the nature of his work sometimes. In the service of God, you had to do what made you uncomfortable sometimes. Casterly was sitting in the corner like a sulking child, his gun held out in front of him as if he might try to off himself at any moment. He looked miserable, the night clearly not going the way he had planned. Marley wasn't sure if the man would even stand when the time came, and the time would come, as it was wont to do. Marley wasn't quite sure what they were doing in town all day, while they huddled here and rested. The Green Man was making new scarecrows, willingly or not, and by the time night fell again, he would have more than enough to surround the station and take them. Marley wept for the parishioners that he was likely to lose in this little skirmish, and made a note to say prayers for each if he made it out of this alive. "I would think having a man of cloth on our side would offer us a little divine intervention," came a sarcastic voice from the corner. He looked over to see Casterly glowering at him from between his knees. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." "Cut the crap," Casterly retorted. "If there is a God, then he must be pretty unimpressed with you to let you falter in a situation like this." Sheriff Carl looked darkly at the two of them, but seemed to be on the fence about whether or not he wanted to get involved in something like this. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Marley asked, feeling he already knew the answer. "I did my research on you, Pastor. I know you used to be Father Joseph Marley, a priest in good standing with the Catholic Church. Most of the people I talked to said you're still remembered fondly, yet you exile yourself to this little backwater and hide amongst a different flock of sheep. Why would a Catholic decide to convert to a Protestant faith, and Baptist of all things, when they were still in favor of the church?" Marley thought about sparking at him, just really letting him have it, but realized that anger was what Casterly wanted. He wanted to be able to point at the old priest and show everyone how irrational he was in the face of his argument. The fact that Nathan Casterly was some kind of a shadow broker for Frazier didn't seem to play into it at all. These were his beliefs, such as they were, and Marley would need to answer them or lose some credibility in the face of people that were likely counting on him. I was a priest in a town in North Germany, a town called Haddelstrom. It was a little farming town, a lot like this, but they too had a problem. After many years of peace and prosperity, a stranger came to town to show them a different way. He told them how his god could grow crops, cure their livestock, and all they would have to do would be to worship him. They would have to build an altar, they would have to make sacrifice, and in the end they would return to ways that would have been very familiar to their forebears. In the end, the righteous were put out, outnumbered by the pagans, and I wasn't strong enough to stand against them. I ran from the people who depended on me, who needed me, and now I'm trying to make amends for my weakness. How noble. I'm glad that Frazier can act as your last chance to get your wings. Casterly grinned like a naughty child who's found a way out of punishment, but Marley wasn't done just yet. Maybe you should ask yourself, Casterly, what you have done to find yourself here. You told those deputies what you knew, and it landed you here with us. Perhaps this is the reward for your righteous action. Maybe God has decided that it's time for you to help someone else instead of just helping yourself. Casterly opened his mouth, but closed it again a moment later. He went back to staring at the rifle of his gun, like he might find solace in it, and Marley went back to patrolling for openings. If he was to die here in the police station, he wanted to make sure that it was a good death. Travis pulled up to the outskirts of Frazier to find that while dawn had come, it hadn't come to the town. The town sat in a deep fog bank, and it swirled around Frazier like a misty serpent. It wasn't a particularly bright day, and it looked as if any Halloween festivities that might have manifested would be rained out. The clouds were thick and purple, and the grumble of thunder made him clutch the pumpkin tightly. He needed to get it there, and he needed to find this green man quickly. He put on his mask and headed for the city limits, but as he stepped into the thick mess of condensation, he was lost amongst the unfamiliar streets of a town that he had known all his life. The mist pressed in on all sides, making him claustrophobic as he staggered up the sidewalk. The candle in his pocket pressed against his leg, the ridges at the bottom making him wince, and the farther he walked, the less distance he seemed to make. He grimaced as the hard lines dug into his thigh, and when he slid the candle out of his pocket, he suddenly had an idea. He put it into the pumpkin and lit the wick, watching dumbfounded as the fog parted a little and he could see the street ahead. As he moved, he listened for the sound of the fountain, knowing he was getting close to Main Street when he heard it lapping. If he could get there, he could find the station, and he had little doubt that if the sheriff was still alive, that's where he was making his stand. He came up Chambers and saw the fountain as it lapped and bubbled placidly. He stopped, however, when he saw the bodies, and realized that he might already be too late. As he walked, he saw Clarence, Mrs. Binks, Seth from the fire station, and his brother Otto, men and women of the town that he had known all his life, all of them dead as they watered the streets. He could almost see Gibbs amongst them, Dreyfus and Gage too if he looked hard enough. The further he walked, the more he saw the sacrifice that they had put on for the town, and the more shit he felt about it. He should have been here. He should have stood with them, but he had been out in the woods figuring things out too late. He saw shapes up ahead and hoped against hope that they might be the holdouts from the militia. When one of them turned, its legs bringing it over in strange herky-jerky movements, Travis raised the pumpkin and blew the candle out through his mask. He looked back to find the scarecrow inches from his face as it stared into his sackcloth eyes. Travis was still for an undeterminable amount of time, and when the scarecrow moved away, he followed it. Maybe it would lead him where he needed to go. Carl shuddered awake when Molly shook him, looking up as if expecting to see scarecrows all around him. "It's time. They're gathering," she said. Carl got up and tried to stretch the crink out of his back. The clock said it was nearly noon, but it looked like sunset from the light filtering through the high windows. Molly had roused the troops, such as they were, and they all looked as ready as they were likely to be. Carl went to the peephole and looked outside, his teeth clicking unbidden as he saw the hordes amassed. There were more scarecrows than there had been last night. So many more. And they were just waiting for the armored figure to call them to action. "Defenders of Frazier," the Green Man said, "you have been given leave to discuss the terms of your surrender. But now it is time to choose. Do you join me, or do you die in agony?" Carl looked back at those assembled, but surrender didn't seem to be an option. "We'll fight till the last, you goblin," he shouted back. "We would rather die than serve you." The helmeted head creaked slightly, as if in acknowledgement. "As you wish." Carl let the flap close an instant before the front was buffeted by a storm of bodies. The scarecrows were just that, but they were in such numbers that Carl heard the glass and the metal groan as they hit it. They were trapped, but they weren't out yet. "Get ready. This is it," he said, wincing as he heard one of the little windows break behind them. Travis heard the armored man yelling, and when the scarecrows moved, he hung back. He was still 60 feet from the knight, and he didn't want to give his advantage away too quickly. If he could get in close, then he could take the man by surprise, but he was also keeping his eye on the pumpkin kid. If he saw him coming, then it could all be for naught. But watching the scarecrows mob the station made him think that time was not on his side. As he worked his way forward, fumbling the lighter in his pocket, he knew he could only get one chance at this. He'd been creeping closer to the stationary giant, but the closer he got, the more he realized that this was a bad idea. If he came right up to that old ghoul with his totem, what would stop it from just smashing it in his hand? He looked around, gauging the right spot, and saw what he was looking for. The town hall was 2 stories high and made of fresh red brick. He stumbled his way towards the building, trying to stay out of the line of sight of the lumbering figures, and when he got to the side door, Travis slipped inside and made his way to the roof. There was a fire escape on the 2nd story, a place where he could be seen but not reached easily. The place where he meant to light the beacon. "The door," Carl said, and Father Marley was moving before he could get his legs in motion. The window had been one of the side offices, and they were already looming up as Marley slammed the door shut and put his back against it. They battered at the wood, bulging the barrier oddly as they tried to come forth. Another window shattered down the hall, and Carl was forced to turn his attention there. There were 4 such offices, and as Sullivan held the door on the fresh entry, some of the others moved the furniture from the other offices to block the doors. As they moved it out, they could already see the cracks forming on the glass, and Carl knew that they wouldn't hold for long. "Head to the back and get some of those old desks from back there. That should be sufficient to hold them in place." They were settling the last one when the doors started jerking too. The scarecrows were falling in like autumn leaves, and Carl was worried that the desks wouldn't be enough to hold them back. The old priest was still holding the door with all his might, and as they blocked Sullivan's door as best they could, they dragged the heavy wooden battleship from Carl's own office to plug the last door. Carl could see something dark sliding down the wood as he came up, and by the way Marley was shaking, he could guess what had happened. He watched as the flash of silver came darting through the wood, and as the desk came to rest in front of the edge of the portal, Carl shoved the priest aside as he helped him to the little couch they kept for guests. He could see a dozen oozing wounds on the man's back, and when he tried to call someone over to help, the priest grabbed his hand.
It's too late, Chef. They've hit something a little bit important. It's only a matter of time.
He clutched Carl's hand, and when someone shrieked and a gun barked, he turned back to see what was going on. The door that Sullivan had been holding was coming open as the defenders of the station tried their best to hold it closed. Mr. Worley was poking the barrel of his rifle through the gap, the weapon booming as it went through the straw men. He got a little too close, however, and when a hand knifed out and caught him in his wattled throat, he fell back as the hand came up to stem the flow. He was dead before he fell onto the remaining Alamo brother, and when the other two doors began to rattle, Carl wondered if this might be their final moments of life. He took some comfort in the fact that he wouldn't die alone in his trailer of a heart attack or a stroke. He wouldn't be found with his pants full of sludge and his eyes still open. Instead, he'd die doing something worthwhile, and that was as good a death as any that a cop could ask for. When a shriek suddenly split the night, he looked towards the covered windows and wondered what fresh horror had befallen them. He didn't notice when Marley's hand went limp, but in between the charge and the climax, he passed on as peacefully as he could. The horse reared as Travis brought the pumpkin to life, and it seemed to work too well. As Travis held it aloft, he expected the horse to charge, the scarecrows to arrive and mob him, or for the armored figure to simply laugh in his face. When the fog began to shrink from the light of that lone pumpkin, Travis sucked in a breath. When the horse capered backward, its rider holding tight to the reins as it looked at the pumpkin in silence, Travis couldn't believe this was working. When the armored figure began to shudder in his saddle, Travis knew that Pa had had the right of it. It was all about the pumpkins. It always had been. He hadn't believed it. Not really, but as the armored giant shuddered in his steel, Travis had to admit the power of this totem. "What?" he heard the pumpkin child say shrilly. "What's wrong?"
"You said they were gone. I told you they had to be gone before I came."
"It's only one. It's just one pumpkin. I did what I was supposed to. I got rid of them." The armored behemoth was still walking backwards, and when he pushed the child off the saddle horn, he barely managed to land on his feet. Travis thought his little pumpkin head would likely smash against the ground now, but he held it aloft as he looked up at his protector in confusion. What was going on? Some sort of falling out, Travis supposed. No! I did what I was supposed to. I got rid of them. I was loyal. I brought the people to you." The horseman was retreating into the dissipating mist as the boy begged, and Travis thought he saw the shadow of his army leaving with him. No! The kid shouted, but it was too late. The spell was broken, the green man was on the run, and the kid was left behind. Travis pulled his mask off and let it fall to the ground, setting the pumpkin down gingerly on the ledge that he had been standing on. It was over. Just like that. It was over. Frazier was saved. Now it was time to count the cost. The scarecrows looked lost, like children after a thunderstorm, and Carl told the militia to move in the face of their indecision. He didn't know what was happening, and he didn't care. All he knew was that now was their chance. They cut them down, smashing and blasting them as they reduced them to so much refuse. The scarecrows mostly just stood there, and the ones who still moved looked lost. They destroyed them easily, trampling them underfoot, and when they were finally done with them, Carl led his militia out of the station. The fog was gone, the green man was gone, and the town was free of the taint. He could see the burning jack-o'-lantern sitting atop the roof of City Hall, and smiled. Someone had done it. The old priest had been right in the end, and Carl couldn't help but think it had been Parks. Whoever it was, The town was safe now, and as the rain began to come down, he had never been happier to be soaked in his life. In all, about 200 citizens had died in the assault on the town. The sheriff had been right in the end. Most of the citizens had hunkered down and waited out the scarecrows, and as the fog dissipated, they came out of their homes to see what had befallen Frazier. That night, they mourned the dead, but they also celebrated the town's victory over evil. Carl was present, retelling the tale of his standoff with the Green Man. Nathan Casterly was there too, also telling tales of the police station skirmish and the bravery of those involved. Molly had been seen sitting with Gilbert Alamo, and it seemed that the two had become quite close. Sullivan, the remains of the volunteer fire department, Darrell Landry, they were all the center of attention as they told their tales, but one face was absent. Carl knew that Parks had been the one to light the pumpkin, but he hadn't come back to the station after the fog had dissipated. No one had seen the pumpkin child either, and Carl had to wonder if the two were together. He supposed he might tell him, if he ever came back. Sheriff Carl hoped that he would. Frazier could use more heroes, like Travis Parks. Travis looked in on the pumpkin kid as he sat with Maggie. The two were talking quietly together, and the little girl looked happier to have a guest. The pumpkin boy was far from good company, but when you'd spent as long as Maggie had without a real friend, it probably didn't make much of a difference. She looked happy without her stuffy pumpkin head to hide her face, and Travis wondered if the boy would ever be able to take his mask off again. "We can keep him here with us," Pa Pumpkin said, making Travis jump a little. "I doubt the Green Man will come after him, but we can keep him hidden as best we can. Maybe we can fix him, remind him of who he used to be." Pa looked very different without his mask, an aging sodbuster with a pretty common face beneath all that gourd. His skin was very pale, after a decade or more beneath the pumpkin, and Travis was glad to see that he and his wife had ditched their disguises. Both sat on the front porch now, totems against the encroaching winter, and Travis hoped that they would never have to don them again. The pumpkin boy looked at Maggie suddenly, and though Travis couldn't see him, he felt like he was smiling. "Whatever you do, just don't let him come back to town," Travis said. "People have long memories, and they will be looking for him." "We'll protect him. You can count on that," Pa was quick to say. Travis had bustled the little guy out of town so quickly that he'd been halfway back to the farm before thinking better of it. The kid had seemed to deflate after the fall of his master, and all that bluster seemed to have gone right out of him. He hadn't said a word since they arrived, not that Travis had heard at least, and seeing him with Maggie now made him think that he might go back to whatever normal looked like for him. Travis left not long after, thanking Pa and Ma for their hospitality and their generosity. Over the years, he would return to the house many times, watching the kid grow alongside Maggie. Maggie never wore the pumpkin again, and over time, the boy's head returned to normal. The town never forgot what had happened on that Halloween, and Travis was as much of a hero as any of the militia. Life in Frazier went back to something like normal, and over time, the town healed. They were careful about their pumpkins, though. Pumpkins became a staple in Frazier, and no Halloween was without a jack-o'-lantern ever again. The altar in the woods was buried, backhoes and tractors used to sink it deep in the earth. They say you can still hear an odd whispering in the woods if you linger there, but it's faint and spidery. The altar still tries to entice people into doing its will, but the townspeople know better now. They know what lies at the heart of the altar, and what demons they might bring forth if they listen for too long. And thus, Frazier became one of the few towns to survive the incursion of the Green Man. But he will always come back. Be mindful of strangeness in your own town, lest you find yourself tested by the Green Man and his minions one year.